particularly cold where that wind is quite blustery. Through this evening and overnight, the showers continue to feed down some eastern areas of the UK, so some fairly heavy showers still perhaps possible through this evening's rush hour across southeastern parts of England, the Midlands. Further west, southwest England and Wales seeing the best of the dry weather with some clearer breaks. Northern Ireland probably escaping most of the showers through the course of today, but one or two around perhaps through this evening. Further north across Scotland, we will see a focus for the showers to perhaps organise themselves into longer spells of rain and hill snow as we go through this evening. And as we go through tonight, we'll start to see more in the way of frequent showers coming back in across northern parts of Scotland. That's courtesy of a more defined area of showery rain and hill snow pushing southwards through the course of tonight. Elsewhere, further south across England and Wales, a mixture of clear spells and patchy cloud. We will see a fairly widespread frost developing once again, particularly in the countryside, lows of -2 or -3 degrees. So tomorrow is going to be another fairly cold day, still quite breezy, particularly for some eastern coasts of the UK. An area of showery rain clearing away from Northern Ireland through the morning, hill snow starting to ease away as well. So once again, the focus for the showers will be across eastern parts of Scotland, central and eastern parts of England once again. Some heavy bursts of rain perhaps possible, and still on the chilly side for the time of year.
Expect a warm front, moving from the kitchen right through to the rest of the house. Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
You could have £17,777 in tax-free cash to play with this spring. Cash to spend on anything you like. And if that wasn't enough, we're also going to give you not one, but two sought-after designer watches and the latest Mulberry handbag. How would winning that sound? For a chance to win the cash, 2 watches and a designer bag, text cash to 63232. One entry costs £2 plus 1 standard network rate message. Or text bonus to 63232. 5 entries cost £5 plus 1 standard network rate message. Go to gbnews.com/win. Entries start from just £2. Call 0903 681 3232. Calls cost £2 plus your network access charge. Or post your name and number to GB12 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 6 p.m. on the 4th of April. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Hello everyone, Patrick Christie's here with an exclusive opportunity just for you, our incredible GB News viewers. We're giving you the opportunity to win a VIP studio tour right here at GB News HQ. Plus, you'll also get to meet yours truly. It's easy to enter, just head to gbnews.com/community competition and follow the easy steps. Don't miss out, enter now, and I'll see you soon at GB News. Full T's and C's apply.
If you want your news to be straight talking...
This is a nightmare for the Conservatives again.
Down to earth.
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
And most importantly, honest.
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them.
Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Mornings don't have to be tiresome, especially if you have the right company.
Wake up to news as it happens, opinion and debate, and of course, a little bit of entertainment too.
Because when the kettle's on, we're on.
That's Breakfast on GB News, a show worth waking up for.
Every morning from 6 a.m.
Only on the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We'll spread the news, you spread the word.
Headliners on GB News 11 p.m. every night. It's got 3 top comedians going through the next day's newspapers so you don't have to read them, which is great.
That's a good point. He's lying. I mean, maybe he's not lying.
That's Headliners every night from 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. as well on GB News, Britain's news channel.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, and as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 12 o'clock on Thursday, the 13th of March. I'm Charlie Peters.
And I'm Miriam Cates. Well, NHS England is being abolished. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer is cutting back on what he calls the flabby state, and he's starting by reforming the health service.
So I'm bringing management of the NHS back into democratic control by abolishing the arm's-length body NHS England.
Meanwhile, police weren't able to prevent the Southport killer carrying out his horrifying attack on young children because of a gap in terrorism laws.
Well, that report comes as latest statistics show the number of terrorism arrests last year is at an all-time high.
And save our piers. GB News heads to Bournemouth and Southport, where the British seaside landmarks are struggling to survive.
And Cheltenham Festival faces another hurdle with record low crowds. Is it falling out of favour with punters after the newly named Style Tuesday records the lowest attendance this century?
Just over 41,000 people coming to Cheltenham yesterday. Today, if they're coming on St Patrick's Thursday, they're having to contend with the hail that we've just started, but plenty of people still making their way in here at the Cheltenham Racecourse.
Well, I'm not really a horse racing expert, but I was presenting this programme yesterday and we threw to Jack Carson a lot and it was absolutely freezing there. And I kind of think if you're going to get dressed up in all your finery with a fancy hat, would you then go out if it's practically snowing?
Yeah, well, he's a resilient guy. I think
he didn't have a fancy hat.
That's true. Well, plenty of the punters are pretty resilient as well. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about that Sir Keir Starmer speech. Also, announcement of the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, right now. I saw that as he's making these announcements for cutting back the state, he was making it at a firm in Hull called Wreck-It, which I think is helpful.
Yes, the British Dodge.
Well
I think,
chosen.
yes, it's a good story. Well, please do send your views and post your comments on gbnews.com/your say about all the different topics that we'll be covering in the next 3 hours. But first of all, we've got your news headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Miriam, thank you and good afternoon. The top stories: the Prime Minister says the British state is weaker than it's ever been as he confirmed plans to abolish the arm's-length body NHS England. Sir Keir said this will bring management of the NHS back into democratic control, adding the healthcare system will refocus on cutting waiting times in hospitals. Sir Keir also said global changes mean now is the time for greater urgency and to go further and faster in delivering reform. He also promised to slash the cost of red tape as he set out his plan to reshape the state to cope with an era of instability. And he also confirmed cutting the cost of regulation for businesses by 25%. Sir Keir Starmer says strength abroad demands security back at home.
National security is economic security. And strength abroad, and we definitely need that more than ever at the moment, but that demands security back at home. Because, look, you're not strong if your energy security is exploited by Putin. You're not strong if 1 in 8 young people are not in education or work. And you're not strong if you lose control of your public finances and you can't build your industries. So that is the test of our times. The goal of my plan for change: national security for national renewal.
Elsewhere, the terror watchdog has published its investigation into the Southport murders by Axel Rudikabana. It recommends the government creates new offences for the preparation of mass killings, but stops short of proposing a change to the terror definition. While current terrorism law requires a specific ideology, the Prime Minister had said he would change it if needed to include perpetrators who commit violence for the sake of violence. However, Jonathan Hall KC said the legal definition is already wide and expanding the threshold would increase the possibility of inaccurate use and, in theory, abuse. Mr Hall also said today police could not arrest the Southport killer before he carried out his attack because of a gap in the law. Well, that comes as terror-related arrests have hit a 5-year high, with 248 last year. Commenting on the release of the data today, Senior National Coordinator for Counter-Terrorism Policing, Deputy Assistant Commissioner Vicky Evans said for the last 18 months, counter-terrorism policing has been operating at a very high operational tempo, and it's no surprise to see our teams arrested well over 200 people last year. Since March 2017, counter-terrorism policing and MI5 have together disrupted 43 late-stage attacks from taking place. The Court of Appeal has been told the father of Sara Sharif should have been given a whole life order for his daughter's murder. Irfan Sharif and Bainash Batul were jailed for life with minimum terms of 40 years and 33 years respectively in December last year after being found guilty of the 10-year-old's murder. Sara's uncle Faisal Malik was found guilty of causing or allowing her death, and he was jailed for 16 years. In a televised sentencing in December, Mr Justice Kavanagh said Sara's death was the culmination of years of neglect, frequent assaults and what can only be described as torture, mainly at the hands of Sharif. All three are bringing bids to challenge their sentences at the Court of Appeal. Donald Trump has threatened the Russian president to accept a 30-day ceasefire with Ukraine this week or prepare for economic ruin. That's as the Kremlin refuses to consider any potential deal before speaking to the US envoy directly in Moscow.
Financial sense, yeah, we could do things very bad for Russia. It would be devastating for Russia, but I don't want to do that because I want to see peace.
Well, this all comes as a classified document obtained by the Washington Post allegedly exposes Putin's plans to divide the Western alliance in order to weaken the US president's negotiating position. Mr Trump confirmed White House officials had travelled to Russia overnight with hopes Russia will agree to a ceasefire deal. Meanwhile, President Putin was spotted making the rounds on the front line of the Kursk region for the first time since Ukrainian troops captured part of it last year. And the US president's latest comments to Russia on that 30-day ceasefire deal come as the Defence Secretary John Healey met with counterparts from France, Germany, Poland and Italy in Paris last night for more talks on Ukraine.
And I say to President Putin, over to you now. You said you want to talk, prove it. Accept the ceasefire, start negotiations and end the war. And make no mistake, the pressure is now on Putin.
And those are the latest GB News headlines. For now, more from me in half an hour.
Well, welcome back to Good Afternoon Britain. It's 7 minutes past 12 and we've just been hearing that NHS England is going to be abolished.
So today I can announce we're going to cut bureaucracy across the state, focus government on the priorities of working people, shift money to the front line. So I'm bringing management of the NHS back into democratic control by abolishing the arm's-length body NHS England. That will put the NHS back at the heart of government where it belongs, freeing it to focus on patients, less bureaucracy, with more money for nurses, an NHS refocused on cutting waiting times at your hospital.
Well, the Prime Minister made this announcement in Hull as part of his so-called Plan for Change, which involves tackling what he has called the UK's flabby, unfocused and overcautious state.
However, Sir Keir Starmer's comments on the state of Whitehall have already sparked a serious backlash from trade unions who've branded his plans unrealistic and insulting. Well, here to tell us more is GB News political editor Christopher Hope. Chris, thank you for joining us. Does it seem strange that a Labour Prime Minister is announcing all these significant cuts to the size of the state when perhaps his backbenchers and voters at large would have expected him to do the opposite?
Yes, and that's why he can do it, I think. And welcome to Reckitt & Benkhauser, which is a big manufacturer of health goods, to both Charlie and Miriam. I think that he's taking a brave move here, Sir Keir Starmer. He's doing things which the Tory government wanted to do. They wanted to wind back those reforms brought in by Andrew Lansley back in 2012, which removed direct control of the NHS to the world's biggest quango, to quote Wes Streeting moments ago. Bringing that back under government control is a huge frustration amongst all ministers I've met over the past 15 years. They didn't have that control over the NHS. That's been given back to them, but it won't be without cost, I think, to the Labour government. It's based in Leeds. He wouldn't deny there could be job losses in Leeds as a result of that. That's NHS England. But Sir Keir Starmer, to his credit, is putting patients first. He says he can't look patients in the eye who are in pain and know, for example, there are 2 sets of communications civil servants, one in Leeds, one in London. There are 2 sets of policy groups, one in Leeds, one in London. He's taking the chainsaw, you might say, the Elon Musk chainsaw, to the world's biggest quango and trying to deliver better outcomes for civil servants. I think that is, frankly, over time, was required, and the kind of thing which a Tory government wouldn't have the permission to do. In a wide-ranging speech just now in Hull, he also talked about the fact that people don't want a bigger state. He wants to cut bureaucracy across the state, as I say, bring back the NHS into the government where it belongs, and so it goes on. I mean, he says he wants to take away red tape, more planning officers, why are cricket balls and how hard they're hit, why are they delaying 140 homes being built in parts of this country. Jumping spiders, he said, were stopping new towns, but no need, he said, to compromise the building standards as he strips away red tape. He says, and I actually do agree with this, he said that often when problems happen in government, the government has a review, a consultation, a new quango is set up. Well, now he wonders why these quangos exist. I think that is what many Tories have told me in the past is the blob, well-meaning ministers introducing quangos to stop problems that have happened and deal with them. For GB News, though, I asked him a question which I know irritates a lot of our viewers and listeners. He said that every pound must be delivered for working people. So I said to him, on behalf of GB News, is today the day that you call time on woke diversity, inclusion and equity policies in the civil service and put taxpayers first? And here's what he had to say.
Every pound has to be spent rightly. Every pound we have at our disposal as a government is not our money, it's taxpayer money, it's your money. It's money that people have put in expecting the government to use it properly and wisely. And we must keep that in mind with every decision that we make. And that's why we're making the announcements that we make today. We're not slashing our commitment to equality and important issues like that. Nobody would expect that. But we are making sure we're stripping away what is unnecessary.
There you have it. We're not slashing equality and inclusion issues. He recognises those are important. Others disagree, but frankly, this is a good start in trying to cut the size of the state and deliver better public services for us all. And just briefly, he was asked about welfare. Now, all this weekend, you'll see in newspapers and on GB News speculation about what will happen next week. The government is looking at unveiling £6 billion worth of cuts to the welfare budget. He said in terms, no return to the austerity, the period of George Osborne over a decade ago, which is so criticised by so many people on the left. But he says we can't spend £70 billion a year on welfare. That's a third of the NHS budget. It's the same budget as the Home Office, Ministry of Justice and the Environment Department combined. He said the welfare system can't be defended on economic terms or moral terms. He's increasingly sounding like a Tory Prime Minister.
And Chris, I suppose you've predicted my question, because looking at some of the language used in that speech, she's referring to a cottage industry of checkers and blockers. How might we anticipate the opposition react to this? Could we see Kemi Badenoch continue to do what she did with the foreign policy announcements, which is welcome the Prime Minister's interventions?
Yeah, I think this is a Labour government which is moving right into the centre ground of British politics, and that, of course, that moves the Lib Dems and the Tories to one side. I've got to say, by the way, scrapping NHS England was not in the party's manifesto last July. It wasn't even suggested by the Tory party. I don't think the Tories had the political space or the courage to do this. They couldn't have won that battle, I don't think, with the unions. So Keir Starmer has that opportunity, and Wes Streeting, of course, the Health Secretary. We're expecting to hear him give a statement, flesh out the details further in Parliament shortly. But it is a brave moment, I think, here to deliver on for patients. I often think when I look at the NHS, all you ever hear about is unions of doctors or nurses rowing with their bosses, the employers, the government, NHS Confederation. But what about people who are being treated? What about people who are in pain, who can't see a doctor for 18 months? And it's those people, I think, who Sir Keir Starmer is putting himself on the side on.
Chris, thank you very much. Yeah, a very interesting turn of events. And of course, yes, it wasn't in the manifesto, but that does suggest that Wes Streeting and Keir Starmer have come into power and found that all this money is being wasted, all these jobs are being wasted, and they're doing something about it. So Sounds good. Well, somebody who might have a different point of view, we're going to speak now to the Director of Policy at the Trussell Trust, Helen Barnard. Helen, thank you very much for joining us. Now, a lot of today's news has been about the scrapping of NHS England, but of course we're also expecting cuts to welfare, particularly to disability benefits. And I understand that you have some concerns about that.
Yes, absolutely. We are very worried, because when you look at people coming to our food banks, already the majority of people are disabled. And when we did some research just last week, we found that if you look at people on universal credit who are getting health or disability payments of some kind, already 3/4 are having to go without essentials. More than 4 in 10 are already missing meals to pay for other essential costs. So the idea that you would look at this and think that the answer is to make these huge cuts to people's incomes, I think is extraordinary. It's very worrying. We are getting lots of messages from people who are just terrified at how they're going to survive these cuts.
And Helen, we've had reaction just in the last few moments from Ed Davey, leader of the Lib Dems, saying that we'll never fix the NHS unless we fix social care, really pushing back on that perspective in particular. Have you had concerns in that area as well in your work?
I think one of the things that we really see is when people are trying to get by on these incredibly low incomes, it massively damages their health. So you get somebody who has maybe had to stop work for health reasons because they're trying to survive without being able to eat properly or pay the bills. Their health is getting worse and worse. And sometimes people can't even afford the bus fare to get to a hospital appointment. And some research we'll be publishing soon. We have looked at what does it cost the country to have such a high number of people in really severe poverty and hardship. And it is costing the NHS and other services enormous amounts of money because, people will instinctively know trying to get by when you can't afford the essentials of life is terrible for your health. It's also very bad for getting people back into work. What we've seen is that people who can't afford to top up their mobile data, for instance, they can't search for jobs, they can't update their universal credit journal, they can't keep in touch with friends and family. People become incredibly isolated and not part of their communities. And that actually makes it so much harder for people to recover and, if they can, to get back into work.
But Helen, there is another side to this, of course, as well, which is that there has been a huge rise in sickness claims for mental health over the past 5 years, particularly for younger people. And whilst, of course, we can't dismiss mental health illness, it is the case that many people, particularly young people with, let's say, anxiety and depression, probably being signed off work and paid sick pay is not the best thing for them. And actually, being in work is a much better route to recovery. And isn't the problem here that we've just mixed physical disability with mental health issues, and that's why the budget's ballooning? And perhaps the government would be best to look at the two different types of disability differently.
I think what a lot of people who experience this would say is that mental health and physical health are very connected. Many people will have multiple conditions. And there are many mental health conditions which are incredibly difficult to manage and survive. But I think it's also worth saying the process to get access to health and disability benefits right now is actually really, really tough. So we have in food banks financial advisors to help people with things like debt and benefits. And the biggest thing that they are doing is trying to help people navigate this incredibly complicated, difficult system to get access to those benefits. But in the meantime, right now, we see people who are incredibly unwell having to, for instance, turn off medical equipment because they can't afford the electricity bill. And that's because the system is so hard to access. And what you see is that when people can't get those things that they really need to manage their disability, whether it's a mental health or a physical health condition, they get worse and actually further away from getting a job. So what we need is to get the right support to people quickly at the right time. And then actually most people really would like to be in work. People want to get out there, they want the social contact, they want the dignity of work. But the answer isn't to cut their incomes, the answer is to get them the right support. And we haven't been doing that very well. Actually,
Helen
the
Ballard
Trump works-
from the Trussell Trust. Thank you so much for your time. Sorry, we've run out of it on our end, but thank you very much. Just quickly, we've had some reaction from the Conservatives to that speech. Alex Burkhardt saying, "We support measures to streamline NHS management and the principle of taking direct control." So we asked Chris Hope that question straight away. The Tories have, in a sense, come back and backed that move. They do go on to say that they think that Labour now have no excuse and they are still not prepared to take the difficult decisions needed on productivity. But the Conservatives supporting this move by Labour to streamline the NHS.
Well, I should think it would have an impact on productivity if they sack half of NHS England. But anyway, we'll wait and see. Well, moving on now. The terror watchdog has published its investigation into the Southport murders, and it's recommended that the government creates a new offence for mass killings, but stops short of proposing a change to the terror definition.
Well, in response, the Home Office has said it will fix the legislation to close the gaps identified. And to explain this more, we're joined now by the GB News Home and Security Editor, Mark White. Mark, what does this announcement mean for our terrorism legislation?
Well, there was a gap really in the legislation there, in that if you were planning a terrorist attack, you can be arrested, you can be charged with that. If convicted, you could be jailed for potentially up to life in prison. However, if you're plotting mass attacks, say a school shooting or something similar, you can't be arrested and charged for that unless you're in the sort of latter stages of that, or you're in a conspiracy with others. So this just tightens up that loophole. That's been introduced, and that is a good thing. I think what will concern other people is probably the issue around the definition of terrorism. In the aftermath of Southport, there was a great deal of concern about whether Axel Rudikabana was a terrorist or not. We were told at the time he wasn't a terrorist because he didn't subscribe to any particular ideology. So the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation was asked to look at whether that definition of terrorism should be widened. He's saying no, because then you run the risk of pulling in those that may be killing more than one person in a gang feud or something like that, something that is clearly not terrorism. So that's one aspect. He was only tasked with looking at the issue around terrorism legislation. But the issue that concerns, I think, most people out there, the issue of what they were or were not told about Axel Rudikabana at the time, has not been addressed by this. It will be, I'm sure, further down the road when we get to that public inquiry. But at this stage, no answers to why the Prime Minister really decided that he felt it was prudent not to tell the public about the fact that he was facing a terror charge.
And I believe Jonathan Hall-Casey, who did this review, did actually comment on that and said that it was the police's responsibility to keep the public up to date with the facts as they knew them, and that had they done that, it would be far less likely that information, some of it misinformation, would have spread online.
There's absolutely no doubt about that. And, the Prime Minister, when he stood up and said that he knew right from the very first days of this that Al-Qaeda documentation, a PDF file linked to an Al-Qaeda-related report, which is illegal under the Terrorism Act, and the rice and poison had been discovered there, but they decided that they weren't going to tell the public for fear of some kind of issue relating to contempt of court and not getting a fair trial at the end of the day, when actually it really doesn't really impact the course of any trial, because it's just like turning around and saying, we can't tell you that Axel Rudikabana has been charged with 3 counts of murder for fear that that will prejudice any upcoming trial. It's a fact that he is going to be charged with this. And later on in the process, just a couple of months before the trial, they did actually tell us about the new charges, where you could argue that at that point it was far more likely to potentially prejudice a trial than right at the very start of it. So no real clear answers from the Prime Minister and others as to why they felt it prudent to sit on that kind of information, which only, of course, fueled the anger and the unrest and the suspicion that was out there at the time.
OK, Mark, thank you very much. And I think lots of people looking forward to that public inquiry and the information it may reveal. Well, this is Good Afternoon Britain on GB News. There's lots more coming up on today's show.
Yes, farmers take to Westminster once again to protest against the government. We'll be going there live next.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
And the BAFTA-winning actress, Daisy May Cooper, isn't holding back about what she thinks about Shakespeare. She thinks it's time to ditch the lot.
Well, comparing his plays to studying EastEnders in 600 years' time, she says that kids would be better off learning from TV dramas. But is she onto something, or is the Bard still a class act?
Sometimes it's better not to say anything, isn't it? Anyway, joining us to discuss this is the lifestyle journalist and parenting expert Annette Kello. Annette, is studying Shakespeare these days the same as if you forced children in 600 years' time to study Pat Butcher?
Exactly. I mean, Pat Butcher's earrings to start with, maybe studying those in 600 years. But I think whilst she has a point that it is very old, I think we need to bring it up to speed and not scrap it, but reimagine it so that people today can learn it. The plays are quite long, which might be quite hard for kids to decipher. But I do think there's something in keeping it. We know that there's loads of words. I think it's 1,700 words that Shakespeare invented. And come on, which ones do you know? Swagger?
Oh, we were talking...
Addiction?
This is cheating, because we were talking a bit about this in the break. But assassination, critic, majestic...
Swagger.
and phrases, like, it's all Greek to me. I mean, these things that just roll off the tongue. I mean, it's so important, actually, for understanding our own language more than anything else.
Exactly, and actually Jay-Z quoted that he takes inspiration from Shakespeare because apparently there's something to do with the rhythm that is similar to rapping. So I think things like that can be a really good lesson for children to kind of get in the zone with it, because it's quite hard to learn otherwise.
I mean, I can imagine it's very hard to teach Shakespeare these days to young children, because they are the TikTok generation.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Nana Akwe, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
No, he didn't say that, though.
I'm so surprised.
I think there's an element of truth to that.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking...
This is a nightmare for the Conservatives again.
Down to earth.
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
And most importantly, honest.
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them.
Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Good Afternoon Britain. It's 28 minutes past 12 and farmers have brought their tractors to Westminster again, seeking to have their voices heard as MPs are going to debate the future of farming in the House of Commons this afternoon.
Now, this comes against the backdrop of, well, a difficult few months for farmers, following the announcement of the so-called family farm tax and the sudden pausing of new applications for environmental payments.
Well, let's cross live to Westminster now and speak to farmer Henry Graham. Henry, thank you so much for joining us, and you're with thousands of farmers and farm vehicles again in Westminster. What's your message to the government today?
Our message to the government is they really need to consider about the implications of what they're doing on this farming in the UK. They are actively destroying family farms and slightly bigger farms and smaller farms and anything to do with agriculture. All the policies they are bringing in is actively discouraging any form of potential growth and even trying to stand still. They're going to make it impossible for us to continue farming, and it will change the whole of this UK countryside.
And Henry, we saw a report today which has found that farming wages have stayed pretty much the same since the 1970s. Average income for a farmer has been £32,000. Do you think that the government have considered that sufficiently when they've been announcing these inheritance tax changes?
No, I really don't think they have considered that at all. And there are many farms that don't even draw a wage of the farmer drawing a wage themselves. That, I would almost say, is quite a large wage in terms of some small family farms which struggle to make a profit. And not only have family wages stayed the same, the price of commodities, such as selling of the wheat and barley, that stayed very similar since the time. But all the inputs have gone up. The price of machinery and fertiliser has gone up. But the actual final product of what you're selling has stayed the same.
Now,
they
Henry,
haven't
one of the
considered
things
it at all.
Now, one of the things that has been used since Brexit to try and subsidise farmers' incomes is this sustainable farming incentive. But we heard yesterday in Parliament that actually the money has run out and the government DEFRA are not accepting any new applications. Can you explain the impact that that will have on some farmers?
We were actually halfway through putting an SFI application in, and it was us planning 3 years in advance. No, you don't do something for an immediate return straight away, and we've actively had to pull out because we cannot go ahead, and it will have a massive impact because all the bits of land and parcels that aren't the best at producing food, the best thing for them would be environmental benefits, such as wild bird mix, so it feeds the birds, and bumblebee mixes for the bumblebees and different bits and bobs. But with a pulling of that, we can't afford to do it. We have to farm it, so it's actively going back generations to where just after the war we had to farm every single inch of ground, of which isn't the way we were moving forward. We had a very good, strong contingency plan, and so did the rest of the world, on moving forwards of food and the environment together, of which was doing really, really well. Labour have just gone along and scuppered it for everybody, again.
Henry, we're seeing pictures on our screens now of all the tractors and machines in Whitehall, in central Westminster. Now, farming has been front and centre of the news agenda for so many months now since those changes were announced. But do you think that so many of those proposed policy changes and what you're discussing today was able to be pushed through because farming just wasn't at the forefront of the British public's imagination and the political conversation?
Farmers are very resilient people, and we don't have to be at the forefront of absolutely everything, and we haven't for many years. We sit in the background, we do what we need to do, we do what we must do to survive as an industry, and we are very resilient. But this is what they're bringing at the moment, absolutely crucifying every agricultural industry, every agricultural business.
Now, at the beginning of the protest, when the family farm tax was first announced last year, there were talks of protests, like we're seeing ongoing protests, but also potentially strikes and refusing to supply supermarkets with essential food items. Is this still a plan amongst farmers?
Anything is an option. We do not want to cause mass disruption in terms of food strikes, so therefore their supermarket shelves become empty. We want to remain very much on the side of the public. We don't want to interfere with everybody's day-to-day lives. We're quite happy being in our own fields, on our own farms, doing our own work. We don't want to interfere, but we can. And if it has to, we will. It is a possibility, but we want to stay on the side of the public. I cannot stress that enough.
Right. Strong words there from farmer Henry Graham. Let's see if the politicians listen. Thanks very much for joining us, Henry. This is Good Afternoon Britain on GB News. There's lots more coming up on today's show.
Yes, it's St Paddy's Day at Cheltenham.
That's why we've done it. We've got all the jewellery on, everything. For me, I've got to be doing the Irish dancing.
Lovely dancing, but the festival is struggling to get more punters like that through the gate as crowds fall to a record low.
But before that, here's your headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Miriam, thank you. The top stories. The Prime Minister says the British state is weaker than it's ever been as he confirmed plans to abolish the arm's-length body NHS England. Sir Keir Starmer said this will bring management of the NHS back into democratic control, adding the healthcare system will refocus on cutting waiting times in hospitals. Well, Alex Burghardt, Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, has said on that, we support measures to streamline NHS management and the principle of the taking direct control. He also says Labour ministers now have nowhere to hide or anyone else to blame on NHS performance. Sir Keir Starmer also said today that global changes mean now is the time for greater urgency and to go further and faster in delivering reform. He promised to slash the cost of red tape and set out his plan to reshape the state to cope with an era of instability and confirmed cutting the cost of regulation for businesses by 25%. The Prime Minister says strength abroad demands security back at home.
National security is economic security. And strength abroad, and we definitely need that more than ever at the moment, but that demands security back at home. Because, look, you're not strong if your energy security is exploited by Putin. You're not strong if 1 in 8 young people are not in education or work. And you're not strong if you lose control of your public finances and you can't build your industries. So that is the test of our times. The goal of my plan for change. National security for national renewal.
In other news, terror-related arrests have hit a 5-year high with 248 last year. Commenting on the release of the data, Senior National Coordinator for Counter-Terrorism Policing, Deputy Assistant Commissioner Vicky Evans said for the last 18 months, counter-terrorism policing has been operating at a very high operational tempo, and it's no surprise to see our teams arrested well over 200 people last year. Since March 2017, counter-terrorism policing and MI5 have together disrupted 43 late-stage attacks from taking place. And the Court of Appeal has been told the father of Sara Sharif should have been given a whole life order for his daughter's murder. Irfan Sharif and Bainash Batul were both jailed for a minimum terms of 40 years and 33 years respectively in December last year after being found guilty of the 10-year-old's murder. Sara's uncle, Faisal Malik, was found guilty of causing or allowing her death and jailed for 16 years. In a televised sentencing in December, Mr Justice Kavanagh said Sara's death was the culmination of years of neglect, frequent assaults and what can only be described as torture, mainly at the hands of Sharif. All three are bringing bids to challenge their sentences at the Court of Appeal. Those are the latest headlines for now. More in half an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
The latest GB News travel.
Hello, good morning. I'm Andy Hilbert with the latest on the roads across the UK for a Thursday morning. In Staffordshire, the southbound M6, long delays and 2 lanes closed due to this accident. Junction 14 Stafford North to Junction 13 for Stafford South. In Cheshire on the southbound M6, 2 lanes are closed due to a shed load of mud. Junction 17 for Sandbach and Crewe to Junction 16 for the D Road at Stoke-on-Trent. In West Sussex, the northbound M23, a lane closed due to a broken down vehicle there. Junction 9 at Gatwick Airport to Junction 8 for the M25. And in Berkshire, the westbound M4, a lane closed due to a broken down vehicle, Junction 8 at Maidenhead to Junction 10 for Wokingham and Bracknell. And in County Durham, the A1M North, partially blocked due to emergency repairs, Junction 63 at Chesley Street to Junction 64 at Washington. That's going to affect you for the Western Highway. And in Suffolk, the A14 eastbound is closed due to a serious accident at the Bury Central Interchange. You're up to date.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, for a frank and honest discussion with those in power that cuts through the spin and gets to the heart of the issues shaping our nation.
You haven't confirmed that you want to stand as leader, but you haven't ruled it out either.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial. Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
I deliver the dose of reality Westminster needs.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's Patrick Christie's Tonight, and here we do things differently. It's explaining the absolute madness of this, doesn't it? It's explosive. I mean, this is very good. It's lively.
850. Your government sat there, Sean, and it did nothing.
It's controversial. And the Middle East has been in turmoil since before I was born. It's everything you need to kickstart your evening. Everyone's had their Weetabix tonight. I love to see it. That's Patrick Christie's Tonight, weeknights from 9 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Mornings don't have to be tiresome, especially if you have the right company.
Wake up to news as it happens, opinion and debate, and of course, a little bit of entertainment too.
Because when the kettle's on, we're on.
That's Breakfast on GB News, a show worth waking up for.
Every morning from 6 a.m.
Only on the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We'll spread the news, you spread the word.
The royal family is an enduring symbol of tradition, unity and pride for Britain. At GB News, we celebrate what makes this country great. In our new royal newsletter series, you can join me, Cameron Walker, for Inside the Palace, an exclusive look every week that takes you beyond the gates and brings you the very latest from those at the heart of the monarchy. Never miss a royal moment again. Sign up now. Go to gbnews.com/royal newsletter and get the latest straight to your inbox.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 20-1. Now, some of Britain's most famous piers are facing an uphill battle to attract visitors near and afar.
Well, this comes as national insurance and energy price hikes are on the horizon following Labour's controversial autumn budget.
Now, today, GB News is visiting two historic British seaside landmarks in Bournemouth and Southport to see what the future holds for each town.
Well, joining us from Bournemouth is Adam Cherry, and in Southport we have Sophie Reaper. Adam, Sophie, thanks so much for joining us. Adam, let's start with you. What's the kind of history of the pier, and is it seen as something that's now in terminal decline?
Charlie, Miriam, hello. I've got the perfect chap to answer those questions because I'm joined on the pier by Rory Holborn, who is the CEO of Adventure Attractions Limited. Rory, thank you for joining us. Welcome. So Miriam was asking about the history of the pier. Is the business in decline? So you run the businesses on this pier. What's the outlook like?
Well, we're not in decline at all. It's actually, I mean, have a good year and it can be very nice. But, I mean, last year was one of the most difficult weather-wise for several. We need the sunshine on the right days.
Yeah, we were just talking about that off air, weren't we? 2 years ago, what was it, 2 or 3 years ago, 40-degree heat wave. And so you're entirely seasonal dependent at the best of times.
It's more than just seasonal. It's actually getting the sunshine on the days when people can come out. Yeah. If the sun shines midweek, term time, it's of no use to anybody. It has to shine when people can come out with their families, and then the business works.
There are also other economic pressures and changing habits. Of course. Consumer habits. Can we talk a little bit about those? Is it more difficult to run a business like this now than it was 5 or 10 years ago?
Oh, well, it's certainly more erratic as the climate changes for people's finances, and the uncertainty, I think, is very difficult for people to plan what they're going to do. We are obviously facing a very, very difficult summer with the results of the last budget. It's going to be a challenge for the entire hospitality industry.
Yeah. And so we again, just off air, we were talking a little bit about that in particular. So the pressures on hospitality, what parts of the budget affect you the most? The national insurance, of course, and also the national minimum wage hikes?
Yeah, they're the big and the dramatic impact on our business. Seasonal businesses employ a lot of youngsters. My first job was clearing glasses and washing dishes. I started as a 16-year-old, and we used to employ a lot of that young age, bring them through. We now have junior managers and supervisors that started with us. Well, they're going to cost us an absolute fortune now. Not just with the minimum wage going up, but with the national insurance, that level coming down to 5,000. This hits the business, all of us. It hits it dramatically.
Yeah. And finally, just talking a little bit about the history of piers. Why are piers important to British culture, British heritage?
Well, I've always said that piers are our Disney castle. They're that memory key for your visit to a seaside town. They've got a great deal of nostalgia, and a bit like going high, everybody wants to walk out over water. It's just something that's innate to us. We love doing it. We just like being somewhere a little bit unusual.
Absolutely. Rory, thank you very much for joining us on GBNews.
Very welcome.
Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Charlie, Miriam, we're here all day. We're going to be chatting to a few more people, more businesses, to find out what it's like to work here and the economic pressures people are facing.
Thanks, Adam. Well, let's cross up to the northwest now, where Sophie Reaper is in Southport at their pier. Sophie, in January, there was a meeting held to discuss the future of the pier. They expected 40 to turn up. Over 400 did so. Why does Southport Pier matter so much to that local community?
Well, I think it's just something that's always been associated with this seaside town. But unlike Adam, I'm not actually able to get onto the pier here behind me because it's been closed since December of 2022. 27 months. This beautiful Victorian structure has been closed to members of the public whilst maintenance work is carried out. So to tell me a little bit about that, I'm now joined by the leader of the Lib Dem opposition, John Pugh. John, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon here on GB News. It's not ideal that it's closed. I think when people think of Southport, they think of the pier. They're synonymous, aren't they? What do we need to do to get this pier reopened once again?
Well, we need to convince the council that it's safe and it's affordable to repair it. If this were a private pier, it would still be open. The council are massively risk averse. You can look at this pier closely and you will see a pier that's in relatively good condition compared with some, but does need repairs. The council simply are not providing that money at the moment. They're putting the begging bowl out elsewhere, but they've been rebuffed. My view is at the end of the day, they need to bite the bullet, find some money. We're not an overborrowed council in Sefton, and start on the pier repair.
Now, there's a sign here just over your shoulder, isn't there, that says the pier is temporarily closed. I think the word temporary there is fast and loose, isn't it, at 27 months. When you speak to the local people here in Southport, the local residents, about how they're feeling that the pier's closed, what are they saying to you?
Well, they're slightly perplexed that it's closed in the first place because they've looked at the pier, they understand it's not, like many piers, completely derelict. They also don't understand why the council won't make some sort of start on it. They're puzzled by their reluctance. The council say perpetually, we're committed to the repair of the pier, but they're not digging into their own pockets. We are building a £72 million conference centre behind the pier, adjacent to the pier. Now, the council have the money to do that, but they appear to have not a penny for the pier.
John, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. There we are. The council, Sefton Council, did put in a pre-application for £10 million to the National Lottery Heritage Fund, but that was denied. So as it stands, we're just not sure what's going to be happening here with Southport's pier.
Sophie Reaper in Southport there, thank you very much. And apparently there were 100 piers in Britain at the turn of the 20th century, now down to 61, and a lot of those, like Southport, are closed, sadly.
Well, yeah, and if you do want to grab some winter sun, it sounds like you're not going to get that at your piers. So here is the forecast for some of the top European holiday destinations.
You're looking happy.
Well, the forecast looks good.
So you've sorted the travel insurance then?
All Clear Travel Insurance sponsors GB News Travel Destinations Forecast.
We've got some warm weather on the way over the next few days across the eastern Mediterranean, but further west, very unsettled still, with some heavy rain and thunderstorms. The showers most prominent across parts of southern Spain through the course of Friday, an improving story across parts of Portugal, but colder than average temperatures across Iberia. Some heavy rain and some snow across northern parts of Italy and the Balkans, but down across Greece, some fairly warm and sunny weather for the time of year with temperatures above average.
All Clear Travel Insurance sponsors GB News Travel Destinations Forecast.
Hello there, good morning. Welcome to your GB News weather update from the Met Office. It's going to be another day of sunshine and showers today. Lighter winds, which means it's not going to feel quite as cold as it did yesterday, but still feeling chilly for the time of year. We can see fewer isobars on the chart, which indicates the winds aren't going to be quite as strong, but we're still getting a lot of our air all the way from the Arctic, adding on to the chilly feel for the course of the day. Also, it's bringing in plenty of showers, particularly along North Sea coast, these feeding in inland through the course of the day. The odd shower could be heavy, likely even bringing some snow towards higher ground, particularly across Scotland. The best of the brightness in the west across Northern Ireland, parts of Wales and parts of Devon and Cornwall too, largely seeing a dry day here, and temperatures highs of around 8 to 9 Celsius, but it should still warm and pleasant in the sunshine and in those sheltered spots. Across Scotland, to finish off the day, we're still going to see a fair few showers feeding in from the northeast. Still, once again, the odd shower a little bit heavy and likely seeing snow, mainly to high ground, but a few flurries possible to lower levels. Largely dry across Northern Ireland. They can't rule out a few showers around coastal areas. And across the rest of England and Wales, still a fair few showers, particularly along eastern coasts, but through the course of the evening, most of these easing away. That's away from those North Sea coasts, once again, main firing line for these showers. And this does bring in a risk of ice where we see any wet surfaces, but plenty of clear skies across the south, which means it's going to turn very cold and likely seeing quite a frosty start by the time we reach Friday morning, particularly across parts of the southeast. But overall, it is going to be a cold start for most, even if you don't see any frost to start on Friday. And once again, we're going to see another day with plenty of showers moving through, particularly once again across those eastern coasts and then feeding in through inland through much of the day. Once again, they could be heavy, likely seeing some sleet and snow, particularly as they start to first feed through around coastal areas, and highs around similar, around 8 to 9 Celsius. That's it from me. Bye-bye.
If you want your news to be straight talking...
This is a nightmare for the Conservatives again.
Down to earth.
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
And most importantly, honest.
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them.
Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
Headliners on GB News 11 p.m. every night. It's got 3 top comedians going through the next day's newspapers so you don't have to read them, which is great.
That's a good point. He's lying. Maybe he's not lying.
That's Headliners every night from 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. as well on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back and good afternoon, Britain. It's 10 to 1. Now, Cheltenham Festival is feeling the pinch as crowds hit a 21st century low.
Well, let's see how they're doing today. Our reporter Jack Carlson is at Prestbury Park, where they're celebrating St Paddy's Day. Jack, what are the crowds like today?
Well, they're certainly in a buoyant mood. They always are here at Cheltenham, those that make the trip here. We're expecting today similar attendances, we believe, to around last year. But you're right to mention the drop in attendances, down about 5,000 from last year, and mirrored really what we saw with the decreasing crowds on Tuesday, which was down to around 55,500 from 60,000. Yesterday saw just over 41,000, just below 42,000 here for Tuesday, for Wednesday rather, Style Wednesday. People there still in buoyant mood, getting dressed up, but it is interesting how many people choosing not to come to Cheltenham this year. This has been picked up on as well by the chief executive of the Jockey Club, Guy Lavender. He took over this course earlier this year as well, acknowledging in his pre-festival notes that the attendances would be down. Still expecting over the course of the 4 days, of course we've got the big day, the Gold Cup tomorrow. That is expected to be a sold-out day for general admission, but admitting that attendances would be down, but calling that not catastrophic, but not seeing growing attendances. There's been lots of feedback given from crowds, and particularly those people choosing not to come to Cheltenham this year, saying very much it is a case of the prices around accommodation, travel, getting here, very much factors which I think are equivalent to the general cost of living as well. So the Jockey Club say that they are working on multiple methods and taking that feedback to try and ensure people can still come and enjoy this festival. Of course, today is St Patrick's Thursday. It's one of the days in the week they decide, because Cheltenham always falls around. There you go, the atmosphere already here behind us, enjoying that first race at 1:20. But St Patrick's Thursday today is that they celebrate St Patrick's Day. There's plenty of Irish horses as well that people will be having a look at. Of course, the first race underway in just over 25 minutes' time.
Cheers, Jack. Well, it's £7.80 a pint at Cheltenham we're seeing, and clearly that lad behind you has got deep pockets. He's got deep pockets.
I'm sure his mother's very proud. Well, you're watching Good Afternoon Britain on GB News. Lots more coming up on today's show, so don't go anywhere.
Yeah, the Bank of England is scrapping diversity rules amid a global backlash. But have they made the right call? We'll be debating that next. But first, let's take a look at the weather.
Despite the morning rain, it'll be a nice, warm, cosy day ahead. Boxed heat pumps, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good morning and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast from the Met Office. So it's staying chilly through the next few days, an icy start in places this morning. There will be a mixture of sunshine and showers, and as I say, temperatures still below average for the time of year. The ice most prominent across parts of northeastern parts of England through this morning. A mixture of sunshine and showers, though. Those showers most prevalent across more eastern and central parts of the UK through the course of today. Still a wintry flavour to them, some snow up over the higher ground. Further west, though, mostly dry skies with a mixture of cloud and sunny spells, and temperatures, once again, are slightly below average for the time of year and feeling particularly cold where that wind is quite blustery. Through this evening and overnight, the showers continue to feed down some eastern areas of the UK, so some fairly heavy showers still perhaps possible through this evening's rush hour across southeastern parts of England, the Midlands. Further west, southwest England and Wales, seeing the best of the dry weather with some clearer breaks. Northern Ireland probably escaping most of the showers through the course of today, but one or two around perhaps through this evening. Further north across Scotland, we will see a focus for the showers to perhaps organise themselves into longer spells of rain and hill snow as we go through this evening. And as we go through tonight, we'll start to see more in the way of frequent showers coming back in across northern parts of Scotland. That's courtesy of a more defined area of showery rain and hill snow pushing southwards through the course of tonight. Elsewhere, further south across England and Wales, a mixture of clear spells and patchy cloud. We will see a fairly widespread frost developing once again, particularly in the countryside, lows of -2 or -3 degrees. So tomorrow is going to be another fairly cold day, still quite breezy, particularly for some eastern coasts of the UK. An area of showery rain clearing away from Northern Ireland through the morning, hill snow starting to ease away as well. So once again, the focus for the showers will be across eastern parts of Scotland, central and eastern parts of England. Once again, some heavy bursts of rain perhaps possible, and still on the chilly.
There will be a light breeze in the morning, leading to a warm front. Boxed heat pumps, sponsors of weather on GB News.
We want to spruce up your spring with an incredible £17,777 in tax-free cash that you can spend however you like. But that's not all, as you'll also receive not one, but 2 brand new designer watches and a fabulous Mulberry handbag. For a chance to win the cash, 2 watches and a designer bag, text cash to 63232. One entry costs £2 plus 1 standard network rate message, or text bonus to 63232. 5 entries cost £5 plus 1 standard network rate message. Go to gbnews.com/win. Entries start from just £2. Call 0903 681 3232. Calls cost £2 plus your network access charge, or post your name and number to GB12 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 6 p.m. on the 4th of April. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Well, taking care of your skin and body is one of the best ways to get in shape for the warmer days ahead. But what are the celeb secrets behind a glow-up? And what latest trends are the A-listers following to look and feel their best? Well, joining us now to share some of those secrets is the founder of Celebrity Skin Talk, Scott McGlynn. Scott, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Hello.
Right, so
spill it.
Here we go.
All your secrets. Well, the main thing is hydration, okay? We've heard it so many times before. Having water daily is a must. I have 15 cups of water a day. It's a must.
What size cup are we talking? Like one of these little ones?
Well, the regular, you know, a bit more bigger than that.
A bit bigger than that. Okay.
Yes,
well, I knew you were coming, Scott, so I came prepared today so you wouldn't tell me off. I've got my big bottle of water.
Check it out.
2 of these a day.
Yeah, and yours is time, which is really cool.
Yeah, like it is. It has all my times. I am slightly behind, but then I have been presenting the news show for the last hour and 40 minutes. So,
so you're
I'm cracking on. Aside from water, what else can we be doing to protect our skin? That's the thing that I'm really big on. I wear Factor 50 on my face every day.
Really?
Every single
day? So even
day.
in the winter?
Yeah. No matter what, because the UV is still coming through, isn't it? No matter what time of year it is. So it's so important. I'm 27 now. give my age away on the telly there. But I'm 27 and I think skincare at a young age is so important. So please agree with me and say, please tell me I'm doing
hydration, what else do we need to do?
Well, the hydration, the SPF is a good point, OK? So I'm Celtic all over. So I'm Welsh, Scottish, Irish, so me and the sun do not go on.
Likewise,
so I'm always a 50 person anyway. If it's raining, snowing, whatever the weather, still wear your SPF. It's a must. And people do not know that the UV rays from our phones, our flat screens, TVs, this is aging us.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 1 o'clock on Thursday, the 13th of March. I'm Miriam Cates.
And I'm Charlie Peters.
Well, NHS England is being abolished. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer is cutting back on what he calls a flabby state, and he's starting by reforming the health service.
So I'm bringing management of the NHS back into democratic control by abolishing the arm's-length body NHS England.
Elsewhere, the Bank of England is scrapping diversity rules amid global backlash. It's to stop businesses suffering from even more bureaucratic burdens.
And we head to Bournemouth and Southport to visit some of the nation's most famous piers. It turns out they're in need of a bit of love these days.
Well, I'm on Bournemouth Pier finding out if it's more tricky nowadays to run a pier, talking to businesses. Is the seaside under threat?
And temporarily closed for essential maintenance. And yet this sign has stood in place for 27 months. We're here on Southport Pier finding out how locals feel about their pier being closed for the past 2 years.
And Charlie, we went to Adam and Sophie in the last hour, and they're talking about the difficulties that some of these pier businesses, these seaside businesses have. And I think it's going to be even harder this year, isn't it, taking on seasonal workers, ice cream sellers, people like that, with the national insurance rise?
Yeah, April's going to be a moody start to the financial year for so many people. And it's a busy intro you've just seen there. Lots of places to go and people to speak to, lots of reporters out on the road. Didn't have time to squeeze in Jack Carson, who's in Cheltenham. He's just told me that it's £7.80 a pint there, and that's also for non-alcoholic beer. So you're paying £7.80 for a soft drink. Now, I know a lot of people are feeling the pinch at the moment, but if you're spending that much money, I think you're making a bit of a mistake there. But send your views, post your comments on any of these stories we're discussing by visiting gbnews.com/your say. But before we get stuck in, let's have the news headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Charlie, thank you. The top stories. The Prime Minister says the British state is weaker than it's ever been as he confirmed plans to abolish the arm's-length body NHS England. Downing Street says abolishing NHS England is expected to take 2 years. Sir Keir also said this will bring management of the health service back into democratic control, adding the healthcare system will refocus on cutting waiting times in hospitals. He also said global changes mean now is the time for greater urgency and to go further and faster in delivering reform. He promised to slash the cost of red tape and set out his plan to reshape the state to cope with an era of instability. And he also confirmed cutting the cost of regulation for businesses by 25%. Sir Keir says strength abroad demands security back at home.
National security is economic security. And strength abroad, and we definitely need that more than ever at the moment, but that demands security back at home. Because, look, you're not strong if your energy security is exploited by Putin. You're not strong if 1 in 8 young people are not in education or work. And you're not strong if you lose control of your public finances and you can't build your industries. So that is the test of our times. The goal of my plan for change. National security for national renewal.
Alex Burkhardt, the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, says Labour ministers now have nowhere to hide or anyone else to blame on NHS performance.
Quite a big announcement, but as ever with this government, there's no detail behind it. Prime Minister hasn't set out how this is going to make life better for patients across the country, hasn't set out how much money he's going to save by doing it. And so, although on the surface it might sound like an interesting idea, the truth is, in Labour-run Wales, they've had this way of doing things for years, and they have the worst waiting times in Great Britain, and they have the worst services in health for patients. So, we really need to see what is actually going to happen here.
And some breaking news that US President Donald Trump has threatened a 200% tariff on alcohol from EU countries unless a, quote, nasty 50% tariff on whiskey is stopped. It is the latest escalation of a global trade war, which this week has ramped up with 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminium entering the US. More on this breaking story just as soon as we get it. Elsewhere, the terror watchdog has published its investigation into the Southport murders by Axel Ruda-Cabana. It recommends the government creates new offences for the preparation of mass killings, but stops short of proposing a change to the terror definition. While current terrorism law requires a specific ideology, the Prime Minister said he would change it if needed to include perpetrators who commit violence for the sake of violence. However, Jonathan Hall, KC, said the legal definition is already wide and expanding the threshold would increase the possibility of inaccurate use and, in theory, abuse. Mr Hall also said today police could not arrest the Southport killer before he carried out his attack because of a gap in the law. Well, that's as terror-related arrests have hit a 5-year high, with 248 last year. Commenting on the release of the data, Senior National Coordinator for Counter-Terrorism Policing, Deputy Assistant Commissioner Vicky Evans, said for the last 18 months, counter-terrorism policing has been operating at a very high operational tempo, and it's no surprise to see our teams arrested well over 200 people last year. Since March 2017, counter-terrorism policing and MI5 have together disrupted 43 late-stage attacks from taking place. In other news, the Court of Appeal has been told the father of Sara Sharif should have been given a whole life order for his daughter's murder. Irfan Sharif and Bainash Batul were jailed for life with minimum terms of 40 years and 33 years respectively in December last year after being found guilty of the 10-year-old's murder. Sara's uncle, Faisal Malik, was found guilty of causing or allowing her death and jailed for 16 years. In a televised sentencing in December, Mr Justice Kavanagh said Sara's death was the culmination of years of neglect, frequent assaults and what can only be described as torture, mainly at the hands of Sharif. All three are bringing bids to challenge their sentences at the Court of Appeal. And an aide to Vladimir Putin has dismissed a short-term ceasefire with Kyiv, saying it's nothing but a temporary respite for Ukraine. That's as Donald Trump has threatened the Russian president to accept a 30-day ceasefire with Ukraine this week or prepare for economic ruin. Now, the Kremlin refuses to consider any potential deal before speaking to the US envoy directly in Moscow.
In a financial sense, yeah, we could do things very bad for Russia. It would be devastating for Russia, but I don't want to do that because I want to see peace.
Well, this all comes as classified documents obtained by the Washington Post allegedly exposes Putin's plans to divide the Western alliance in order to weaken the US president's negotiating position. Mr Trump confirmed White House officials travelled to Russia overnight for talks with Moscow, with hopes Russia will agree to a ceasefire deal. Meanwhile, President Putin was spotted making rounds on the front line of the Kursk region for the first time since Ukrainian troops captured part of it last year. Those are the latest headlines for now. More from me in half an hour.
Welcome back. It's 7 minutes past 1, and the big news story from this morning is that NHS England is going to be abolished.
So today I can announce we're going to cut bureaucracy across the state, focus government on the priorities of working people, shift money to the front line. So I'm bringing management of the NHS back into democratic control by abolishing the arm's-length body NHS England. That will put the NHS back at the heart of government where it belongs, freeing it to focus on patients, less bureaucracy, with more money for nurses, an NHS refocused on cutting waiting times at your hospital.
Now, the Prime Minister has made this announcement as part of his so-called plan for change, which involves tackling what he has called the UK's flabby, unfocused and overcautious state.
However, Sir Keir Starmer's comments on the state of Whitehall have already sparked a serious backlash from trade unions, who've branded his plans unrealistic and insulting. Well, let's go to Downing Street live now and speak to Catherine Forster, who is fresh out of the lobby briefing and with some fanfare, by the sound of it, behind you as well. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us. A lot of people are very surprised that this kind of announcement is coming from a Labour Prime Minister. What do you think the reaction will be from his own backbenchers?
Yes, good afternoon. I think you can hear the noise of some tractor horns just at the end of Downing Street. I hope you can hear me okay. But yes, to be honest, this is really quite a bold move. This government promised change, didn't they? That's part of what got them elected. And we've seen them as being a little bit timid, but it seems to be that we're now beginning to see that change. And this is really rather big because NHS England is the world's biggest quango, and they are going to get rid of it. They say that it's basically duplicating what the Department of Health already does, and that it's going to save, they say, hundreds of billions of pounds, which can be invested back into frontline service. Now, the Conservatives have already welcomed this, and I have to say that this is the sort of thing that many Conservatives would have liked to have done, but just didn't over 14 years. And of course it reverses those top-down reforms brought in by Andrew Landley back in 2012 that Wes Streeting, the current Health Secretary, says have been absolutely disastrous. So they're saying this. Prime Minister spokesman in lobby told us it's going to fix a broken system holding back hard-working staff from doing their best for patients. They've been very careful to say this is not about the individual workers, not about the staff. This is about the system. The system is broken because, of course, this is going to be many unpopular. We asked in lobby about job losses. They wouldn't be drawn. We understand that the whole process is going to take about 2 years. But Wes Streeting, speaking in the last few minutes, has outlined potentially 10,000 job losses. So a really big decision that's been made by the government, and I think it sets a direction of travel. Other topics in lobby was totally dominated by this, I would say, were increasing talking about the benefit reforms. We're expecting to hear the details of that next week. We know that Number 10 is holding briefings with many unhappy Labour MPs about that. They're being told that it's still up for discussion. I'm not sure quite. Let's see what happens next week. But also on tariffs, they still say they are prioritising engagement with the US to protect our steel industry, but they're focusing on having talks, not escalating tit for tat into a trade war, because they're hoping to get a broader economic deal. One to watch on that.
Catherine, thank you very much for that report live from Downing Street. And of course, it is going to be very interesting to see how the politics of this develop. So we're certainly moving away from the idea that everything should be taken out of politicians' hands, but actually maybe it should be back in democratic control.
Yeah, sure. And Jeremy Hunt in the Commons earlier also said that he commends Labour for this announcement. I'm waiting to see where some of that criticism is going to come of this decision, really. I've seen some people online saying that it doesn't really matter who manages the NHS. Some of the structural problems are still there. It's still a socialised healthcare system that comes with some issues. But so far, the politics, pretty
It's true, but certainly now in my brief period on the Green benches, one of the huge frustrations for ministers was that they knew sometimes exactly what was wrong, but they practically could not do anything about it because it was under the jurisdiction of NHS England. So I do think this will actually hopefully result in some improvement.
Well, there we go. Well, moving on, the majority of nurseries have said they'll have to raise fees and cut the number of free places they offer due to what they call a perfect storm of changes, including the government's national insurance hike.
The Early Years Alliance, which conducted the research, said that the findings should set alarm bells ringing across government.
Now, to tell us more is the CEO of the Early Years Alliance, Neil Leach. Neil, what's been your reaction to the concerns that you've shared with other people?
I think everybody, in terms of working in the sector, absolutely understands this. And I also think, frankly, government has a strong vision of what the problems are. The reality is that I don't think Treasury, frankly, worked out the consequences of the national insurance increases. And therefore, we're delivering government hours, but they haven't actually factored in that cost into the rates that they pay our providers. Somebody has to pay. And I'm still waiting for a response as to how, dare I say, government expects us to basically make up the difference for delivering their hours. So it's chaos at the moment. I confess it is chaos.
Now, Neil, for some time, the hourly rates paid to early years providers for the free 3- and 4-year-old places have been considerably below cost price. Now, the reforms announced nearly 2 years ago now were meant to change that and introduce much higher fees per hour for the younger years. But what you're saying now that even those higher rates for the 9-month-old, 2-year-olds, for example, are now underneath cost price because of the national insurance changes?
But if you come back to the 3- and 4-year-old rates, for example, okay, under a Freedom of Information request, we were told, and we managed to get it after 2 years of pursuing this request in 2021. So I'm going back a few years, but you'll see the relevance in a moment. We were told by the government that, their words, not mine, that to adequately fund the sector per hour for a 3- and 4-year-old, they would have to pay an hourly rate of £7.49 in 2021. What they paid the sector was £4.89 basically at that point in time. We're lucky if we get £5.50 in 2025, and that's after double-digit inflation, etc. So you can see, on their own words, there is a massive shortfall in funding. Now, historically, it has been parents who have been prepared to pay for lunches and extras that have cross-subsidised that, and those parents who do not qualify for the government's entitlement hours, they have basically propped up the system. Now we have very little room for manoeuvre, and who's going to make up the shortfall? And that's the big problem. All at a time, of course, when the government is looking to expand its free entitlement hours so they can get predominantly, dare I say, mums back into the working environment. That's about to topple over unless there's adequate funding.
Now, of course, a lot of people would say, Neil, that this isn't necessarily the best way of funding the system. You've got this very strange system where I think the government is now responsible for buying 80% of the available childcare places, or at least it will be come September once the 30-hour entitlements rolled out. And yet, essentially, they've fixed the price at a level which nurseries can't supply. Are you suggesting that nurseries will just, in the end, just have to close if they can't meet the government's expectations?
I'm not even suggesting that. I can be quite definitive. They will close. We as an organisation represent around 14,000 nurseries, preschools, childminders across England. We're a charity, not for profit, so we don't have to, improve our balance sheet or improve the profit and loss account. Let me tell you that 5.5 years ago, we operated 132 settings exclusively located in areas of deprivation. Today, we operate 39. Those settings, like every other provider out there, are under even more pressure. The impact of the national insurance increase and the impact of the increase in minimum wage added £1.2 million to our bill. Now, is that what was really intended for a voluntary sector operator? And regardless of whether you're voluntary or private, this is about young children's education. These are the most important years of their life. The Prime Minister, the Secretary of State, all agrees this is a major priority. And yet Treasury somehow think that we can do it on a shoestring budget. It is ridiculous.
Neil, you said that these findings should set off alarm bells throughout government. How much engagement have you had from Whitehall or ministers as you've been raising these concerns?
Well, I have to say, and I think this will sound slightly sycophantic, but in the last half a dozen months, let's say, I've had probably more meetings with the Department for Education, Secretary of State, ministers than I had in the previous decade. So in terms of intention, engagement, it's absolutely there. But that counts for nothing if the Treasury are holding back funding and finances. Words alone won't do it. Words alone, basically, will just make settings close, or they will have to increase prices to parents. That's surely not what was intended. That wasn't intended pre-election, but we have to see something change beyond intention and words at this point in time.
Neil Leach, CEO of Early Years Alliance, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, this is Good Afternoon Britain on GB News, and there's lots more coming on today's show. The Bank of England, it's scrapping diversity rules amid a global backlash. But have they made the right call? We'll be debating that right after this break.
Exciting news. Every Friday, my Patrick Christie's Tonight Show is going to have a twist to it. We're welcoming some special guests. You. That's right, on Fridays I'm going to be doing my show in front of a live studio audience because this show is about you and what you have to say. It's going to be the same big debates, same big topics, same big opinions. But every Friday night at 9 p.m, you are invited to come on down to Patrick Christie's Tonight to be a part of the action. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, for a frank and honest discussion with those in power that cuts through the spin and gets to the heart of the issues shaping our nation.
You haven't confirmed that you want to stand as leader, but you haven't ruled it out either.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial. Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
I deliver the dose of reality Westminster needs.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and my show is your opportunity to cut through all the noise and dive in headfirst to some robust debates. Ideas clash.
Situation, isn't it?
Because
the failure is...
You're deliberately avoiding my point. Nothing's held back.
And if you think this is the end of it, wait for more.
And we do not shy away from the difficult stuff. Sometimes I want to shake people and say, if only you understood. So join me on Jubes & Co. weeknights at 6 p.m, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Mornings don't have to be tiresome, especially if you have the right company.
Wake up to news as it happens, opinion and debate, and of course, a little bit of entertainment too.
Because when the kettle's on, we're on.
That's Breakfast on GB News, a show worth waking up for.
Every morning from 6 a.m.
Only on the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We'll spread the news, you spread the word.
This is Britain's Newsroom, where your voice matters.
It's just astonishing. With expert analysis and honest opinion, we don't just keep you informed.
We bring you unique perspectives you won't see anywhere else.
Can't argue with any of that. When the news happens, it happens here.
On Britain's Newsroom, weekdays from 9:30 a.m.
Only on GB News.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, and as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
If you want your news to be straight talking...
This is a nightmare for the Conservatives again.
Down to earth.
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
And most importantly, honest.
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get the book thrown at them.
Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back and good afternoon, Britain. It's 21 minutes past 1. Now, diversity targets for city firms have been scrapped as regulators drop plans to enforce diversity, equity and inclusion rules.
The Financial Conduct Authority and Prudential Regulation Authority say government priorities have shifted towards growth, making a major U-turn.
And it's not just diversity in the firing line. There are also plans to name and shame investigated firms. They've also been axed.
Well, joining us now is Head of Lifestyle and Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs, Christopher Snowdon. Christopher, thank you very much for joining us. A lot of people are welcoming this news, this U-turn on the FCA's diversity commitments. Do you share their enthusiasm?
I'm enthusiastic about anybody dropping DEI nonsense. It is really quite overtly racist and sexist. That's been the conclusion of the US Supreme Court, which is a large part of the reason why all this stuff is collapsing worldwide. I mean, this stuff is now quite rightly illegal in America, so all the big firms are having to drop it, and it makes sense for certainly any internationally trading firms to do likewise. It's also extremely wasteful and inefficient.
Well, Chris, do you think that the alpha male culture in the financial sector, they're going to be rejoicing at this announcement because it's going to get rid of all the sort of HR processes and might lead to some more barriers being reinstated in access to the city?
No, I don't think there are. I don't think there is any access to the city. I think the city actually is incredibly meritocratic. All the city care about is whether you can make lots of money. It doesn't matter whether you're a young, old man or a woman or what colour you are. So, yeah, I wouldn't be worried about that at all. If it brings down some HR barriers, then good. There's far too many HR barriers. Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have been making some good noises in this direction, as they have with various other things recently. We'll have to see whether they actually want to do anything about it. But a huge amount of time, energy and money is wasted complying with all sorts of silly HR things that shouldn't be there. No company that is small or even medium-sized should have to have an HR department at all. You used to have personnel departments, and that's really what you need for hiring and firing. These days, even quite small companies have to jump through a lot of hoops in order to comply with a whole load of legislation that you have to be an expert to understand or even know it exists. This is a major barrier to growth, actually, in this country. So, yeah, the DEI stuff is objectionable on ethical grounds, because, as I say, it's racist and sexist, but it's also inefficient. But there are lots of other HR-related things that really serve no purpose, introduced by people like Theresa May, who wanted to have gender pay gap reporting, racial pay gap reporting, all this nonsense. It's not needed. We are not a racist or sexist society, and businesses have no incentive to be racist or sexist. They have the incentive to get the right people along for the jobs.
Indeed, and under these plans, companies would have had to report on their diversity targets every year, and their success, if you want to call it that, would have been linked to the pay of senior managers. But it's also being reported that we might be being a bit premature in celebrating this U-turn because the Employment Rights Bill, which is before the House of Commons at the moment, will actually introduce these kind of targets for all employers, not just financial services. Do you think that, in fact, the Employment Rights Bill could be just as bad as the policy that's been scrapped?
Quite possibly. And what should be scrapped, actually, is the Equality Act, which allows all this kind of stuff to happen. Like I say, it's racist and sexist, and that was previously, quite rightly, illegal. In terms of sexism, for example, since 1975, it's been illegal to discriminate on the basis of gender. But that is now not only legal, but to some extent encouraged. And if you take, for example, the BBC and a lot of other public sector organisations, but the BBC explicitly says they welcome applications from certain backgrounds, with a very strong hint that certain people are going to be, their CVs are going to go in the bin. But not only that, it has programmes for apprentices that are only available to people of certain ethnicities. This would be unacceptable if the boot was on the other foot. If they were saying we're only accepting applications from white people, obviously that would be outrageous. It is just as outrageous the other way around.
But Chris, how sincere, how heartfelt, how genuine do you think this scrapping really is? I mean, you mentioned right at the start that you think this is just a reaction to changes made in the Supreme Court in Washington. Very quickly, the politics could turn and we could see all of this coming back. Do you think that those in government actually agree with your perspective, or they're just doing this because Washington has changed the vibe?
I think that Washington changing the vibe has allowed a lot of people who have always been uncomfortable with this kind of thing to say, actually, I am prepared, I'm Spartacus. And once it starts to crumble, it falls away very quickly, because very few people actually benefit from this, except people at the top of the HR pyramid and a few academics. It's not good for the economy. Most people realise that it is basically morally wrong. And it's been quite impressive, actually, if you look since the election in America, how quickly a lot of this stuff has fallen away. There's a long way to go, you're quite right. But I think that the momentum is now with the sane people.
Christopher Snowdon, thank you very much for your time. Well, I hope he's right and things are moving in the right direction. And as you said, it is giving people, even on the left, permission to start questioning this kind of ideology.
Yeah, well, they want to go for growth. It's going to cost them hundreds of millions of pounds if they would have had that regulation in place. Well,
indeed.
Anyway, moving on, because Britain's leading vape retailer is protesting the upcoming tobacco and vape bill outside the Scottish Parliament today. But, as Tony Maguire reports, the government believes it's a small price to pay to keep children away from a path to addiction.
Currently working its way through Westminster, the tobacco and vapes bill will impact more than 1 in 10 British adults. Rachel Reeves has ramped up vaping regulations to control flavours, product design and marketing, and doubling the price of liquids through taxation.
A flat rate duty on all vaping liquid from October 2026.
Smoke-free charity Ash Scotland has applauded the government decision, saying it was essential restrictions were introduced to eliminate targeted marketing at children. But UK vape specialist retailer VPZ has mixed feelings on the issue. Director Greg Fowler says he'd rather work with the government than campaign against them.
We're halfway there to this being something really positive, but let's not leave any loopholes that can make it negative further down the line. Invite us to the process. Don't leave us on the outside and then have us saying, told you so down the line. We are here to help. We want to be on the whiter than white side and make this work to make Britain the most successful smoking cessation country in the world.
VPZ's concerns are shared by social media influencer Laura Young, who's spent years highlighting the growing problem of discarded disposables on our streets. She says black market manufacturers are getting a little too good at skirting the law.
It's a whole new industry that we are trying to tackle, and we've already seen ways that the vaping industry is trying to get around some of these. They're shoving a charging port in the bottom and hoping that that'll solve the problem, even though you can't then refill it, or they're offering refillable pods but you can't recharge it, and so we're already finding that it's tricky to work with this industry on a brand new product.
Before the tobacco and vapes bill goes to the final vote, Labour has rejected regulatory proposals to clamp down on illegal devices. If passed in its current state, child protections may get stronger in the short term, but it still leaves the glaring issue of a thriving black market, becoming increasingly nimble at operating in the grey areas of the law. Tony Maguire, GB News.
Thanks, Tony. This is Good Afternoon Britain on GB News, and there's lots more coming up on today's show.
Oh, I do like to be beside the seaside, but with piers struggling to stay open, is the historic British summer at risk?
Good afternoon. The top stories from the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister says the British state is weaker than it's ever been, as he also confirmed plans to abolish the arm's-length body NHS England, Downing Street, saying abolishing NHS England is expected to take 2 years. Sir Keir Starmer said this will bring management of the NHS back into democratic control, adding the healthcare system will refocus on cutting waiting times in hospitals. He also said global changes mean now is the time for greater urgency and to go further and faster in delivering reform. He promised to slash the cost of red tape and set out his plan to reshape the state to cope with an era of instability. And he confirmed cutting the cost of regulation for businesses by 25%. Sir Keir Starmer says strength abroad demands security back at home. In other news, terror-related arrests have hit a 5-year high, with 248 last year. Commenting on the release of the data, Senior National Coordinator for Counter-Terrorism Policing, Deputy Assistant Commissioner Vicky Evans said, for the last 18 months, counter-terrorism policing has been operating at a very high operational tempo, and it's no surprise to see our teams arrested well over 200 people last year. Since March 2017, counter-terrorism policing and MI5 have together disrupted 43 late-stage attacks from taking place. And finally, an aide to Vladimir Putin has dismissed a short-term ceasefire with Kyiv, saying it is nothing but a temporary respite for Ukraine. That's as Donald Trump has threatened the Russian president to accept a 30-day ceasefire with Ukraine this week or prepare for economic ruin. Well, that's as the Kremlin refuses to consider any potential deal before speaking to the US envoy directly in Moscow.
Financial sense, yeah, we could do things very bad for Russia. It would be devastating for Russia, but I don't want to do that because I want to see peace.
This all comes as a classified document obtained by the Washington Post allegedly exposes Putin's plans to divide the Western alliance in order to weaken the US president's negotiating position. Mr. Trump confirmed White House officials travelled to Russia overnight for talks with Moscow, with hopes Russia will agree to a ceasefire deal. Meanwhile, President Putin was spotted making rounds on the front line of the Kursk region for the first time since Ukrainian troops captured part of it last year. And those are the latest GB News headlines. For now, more news from me in half an hour.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Crash Law 24 sponsors the GB News Finance Report.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.2922 and €1.1937. The price of gold is £2,278.51 per ounce, and the FTSE 100 is at 8,548 points.
Crash Law 24 sponsors the GB News Finance Report.
The latest GB News travel.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Andy Hilbert with the latest on the roads across the UK for your Thursday afternoon. In Hertfordshire, the anti-clockwise M25 partially blocked due to an accident. Junction 23 for the A1M at South Mims, with the queues back towards Junction 24 at Potters Bar. The M25 QE2 bridge clockwise in Essex, partially blocked due to an accident. In Staffordshire, the southbound M6, long delays and 2 lanes closed because of emergency repairs following an earlier accident. Junction 14 Stafford North to Junction 13 for Stafford South. And in Cheshire, the southbound M6, 2 lanes are closed due to a shed load of mud. That's going to affect you from Junction 17 for Sandbach and Crewe to Junction 16 for the D Road at Stoke-on-Trent. And in Suffolk, the eastbound A14 is closed due to a serious accident at the Bury Central interchange up to Junction 44 for the Bury Eastern interchange at Morton Hall. It's causing some queues there, I'm afraid, this lunchtime as well. Across the UK, Europe Today.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
Headliners. Tomorrow's papers tonight, every night from 11 p.m.
Ban criminals from pubs and sport games instead of sending them to prison, Minister suggests. So this is Sara Sackman said the bans, as well as mandatory work for offenders, very much in the mix. So this is all part of what's going on with the Leveson review, and there's and he's reviewing the criminal courts and David Gauke's review of sentencing, and they're looking at sort of ways that they can send people to prison. It's very much of a theme at the moment.
Not dealing with the causal factors.
None of the dealing of the causal factors. None of looking back into society or the community and saying what's causing this in the first place. How can we prevent any of this? And you know what? It assumes that all criminals like sport, socialising, and going to the pub. If they don't, then they're getting away scot-free. If you are a criminal and you're thinking, well, I don't really enjoy the pub. I'm not that sociable.
If you're antisocial in the first place, then that's why you committed the crime.
And a lot of criminals are. You know, they keep themselves to themselves.
I think you should go to your sentencing dressed out in a football kit.
Yeah, just got a full kit on. Oh, I was on the way to the pub.
Please don't stop me playing football. This is more akin to, you know, a mum punishing a naughty child, you know. Right, you're not allowed to go out and play table tennis because you're being bad. You're not going to the party. I mean, why don't we just tell criminals that Father Christmas isn't coming for them this year and see if that stops them? You know,
it doesn't really explain how this is going to work.
No. It actually makes lockdown worse than a criminal sentence.
Well, it was.
You know, what we went through was worse than that because we weren't allowed to exercise or do any of these things. And do you know what? There's no deterrence in this anymore.
Well, that is a really good idea you've just had.
What? What was my idea, Josh?
If they don't want to send people to jail, they should go back to, like, the Tier 1...
Just lock them down.
Rules.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Welcome back. It's 25 to 2, and as Sir Keir Starmer announces he's scrapping NHS England as part of a wider effort to cut bureaucracy, let's get the thoughts of health policy analyst Roy Lilly. Roy, thank you very much for joining this. What's your reaction to the news this morning that NHS England is going to be scrapped?
It's a good move. We have to go back to the Lanza reforms in 2012-14, where he introduced the concept of an arm's-length body to run the NHS. It was never going to work because ministers, you know, are held accountable in the House of Commons for what is happening. They want to dabble. So over time, the Department of Health has sort of set up a mirroring office to pretty much copy everything that NHS England has done. There's a huge amount of duplication. So getting rid of that duplication is a good thing. So I think most people in the NHS will regard it as a good thing. However, it will be very complicated. Wes Streeting said in the House he's given himself 2 years to do it, and he didn't think it would require primary legislation. I don't think that's right. I think it will require primary legislation to undo primary legislation. And so it's got to find a passage through the House of Commons at a pretty busy time. But I think most people recognise that the duplication had got out of hand, and the incoming new government, of course, there's been a clear out already of some of the top jobs in NHS England. The chief executive has gone, the chairman's gone, the finance director has gone, the medical director has gone. So, you know, I think they've been given the nod, and they've gone, and they've cleared the way really for Wes Streeting to carry out the reforms. However, of course, what it does do, it takes us back 30 years pretty much to the last time the NHS was actually run by a minister from a desk in Whitehall. He will be very exposed in a way that he isn't now. He is the guy running the NHS. He'll have a board around him and a chief executive, but he will be held accountable for this, and his feet will be held to the fire. So it's not an easy job for him, but I think broadly it's a good move.
And Roy, we've seen some Tory reaction to the move, very much welcoming it, even in the last hour or so. Lord Bethell, who was a health minister in the last government, saying, I wished we'd had the guts to do this. What are you hearing from other health analysts about this move?
Yes, they're all saying the same thing. I mean, when the Lansley reforms went through, David Cameron actually put a pause on them and got someone to examine them. He wasn't very independent, and he kind of got the answer he wanted. But he tried to pause it. And in David Cameron's biography, he talks about this period of time with the Lansley reforms, and he says he wished he'd been tougher and he'd stopped it. I mean, most people look back on it, realise it was chaotic at the time. All of the existing organisations were turned into arm's length bodies. There was a real tangle of line of sight communication and responsibilities. It was a nightmare. It was a bad deal from the off. The NHS made the best that it could. If we cast our mind back to Simon Stevens, who is now Lord Stevens, who was the chief executive of the NHS going into COVID, he and Jeremy Hunt, who was the Secretary of State at the time, a Conservative Secretary of State, they both did their best to put workarounds in place to try and avoid the worst excesses of the muddle that it was. And they were pretty successful, actually. And then, of course, going into COVID, everything got forgotten. But this is really a good move. And I'm not surprised the Conservatives are fessing up and saying they should have done it themselves. They really should. And there was no excuse not to do it. In fact, they shouldn't have done it at the time.
Now, going back to when NHS England was established, and indeed an awful lot of other quangos established during the Blair government and soon after, the kind of political zeitgeist of the day was that we should take decisions out of the hands of politicians because they operate on 5-year electoral cycles, and we need a much more long-term plan to deliver, for example, for health. Do you think there's a danger now that if the NHS is run by a minister from his desk in Whitehall, as you've said, that too many short-term decisions will be made in line with the electoral cycle?
Do you know, that's a really good point, and you're absolutely right. That is a risk. I mean, you get a risk of an arm's length organisation, and you get a risk of it being run from Whitehall. I mean, Streeting will be much more exposed, and the extent to which he's going to be frank about what's going on is another matter, and it's a matter, I suppose, for the House of Commons to hold him to account. But you know, either way, this comes with pluses and minuses. What we've got, if we'd have had NHS England without the duplication in the Department of Health, it would have been fine and it would have worked. But ministers can't ever resist that. And of course, they do have to stand up at health questions on a Thursday or whenever it is and say, you know, answer a question from the Member of Parliament from Little Muxwaith somewhere that, you know, my constituent Mrs. Smith can't get a hip operation, and what are you going to do about it? They are accountable, and it is public money. And Keir Starmer today accepted that and acknowledged that and said, you know, we want to be more accountable. Well, good luck with that, because I think, you know, they'll find it pretty difficult. But broadly speaking, I think this is a good move. And we've already moved Health Education England, NHS Digital, these were all arm's length bodies back into NHS England. So, people have been complaining about the number of people that were working for NHS England. It's about 13,000. A lot of it is because a lot of the old arm's length bodies have been brought back into the centre. All told, I think there's going to be about 9,000 redundancies, which is, not good for the people that work there and their families. But, broadly speaking, it should free up about £500 million, which Streeting says he's going to put back into frontline care. Well, we'll have to see if that comes good.
Roy, we're talking about the political reaction to this decision. As you said, it's all been very welcome. I have to say, I reckon that Labour and the government will be quite nervous about how it looks just in terms of a headline. Labour scrapping NHS England. Do you think they're nervous that people will see that and not understand the full picture and are worried that Labour are scrapping the NHS, not really understanding what an arm's length body is or what a quango is? What do you think sort of measures are being taken within the government to get around that potential comms crisis?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, we should make it clear that they're not scrapping the NHS. They're just scrapping the organisation who ran a bit of the NHS. I personally, I don't think there's much of a risk there. And I tell you why. Because I don't think that the public really understood how the NHS was run anyway. I mean, I used to, get endless emails from people explaining to them, and I had to explain to them, the Department of Health is different from NHS England, and the decisions were different, all the rest of it. I think, broadly speaking, the public just thought, it's NHS, it's the NHS, somebody runs it up there in Whitehall, and they didn't really care who it was. And so I don't think there is a communication issue there. I think what the communication issue will be now is, well, okay, if you're going to do this, what does it mean for patients? And the answer to that is probably not a lot. The NHS is still going to be run from the centre. There's still going to be accountability in the system, and it remains to be seen whether or not Wes Streeting can make good on his promise to free up £500 million quid's worth of money back to the front line. And just let's remember this, they weren't elected to cut NHS England. They were elected to cut waiting lists. And that will be the acid test. Will we see waiting lists come down under this new regime?
Roy Lilly, health policy analyst, thank you so much for your time. Now, if you are in search of some winter sun, here is the forecast for some of the top European holiday destinations.
You're looking happy.
Well, the forecast looks good.
So you've sorted the travel insurance then?
All Clear Travel Insurance sponsors GB News Travel Destinations forecast.
We've got some warm weather on the way over the next few days across the eastern Mediterranean, but further west, very unsettled still, with some heavy rain and thunderstorms. The showers most prominent across parts of southern Spain through the course of Friday, an improving story across parts of Portugal, but colder than average temperatures across Iberia. Some heavy rain and some snow across northern parts of Italy and the Balkans, but down across Greece, some fairly warm and sunny weather for the time of year with temperatures above average.
All Clear Travel Insurance sponsors GB News Travel Destinations forecast.
Hello there, good morning. Welcome to your GB News weather update from the Met Office. It's going to be another day of sunshine and showers today. Lighter winds, which means it's not going to feel quite as cold as it did yesterday, but still feeling chilly for the time of year. We can see fewer isobars on the chart, which indicates the winds aren't going to be quite as strong, but we're still getting a lot of our air all the way from the Arctic, adding on to the chilly feel for the course of the day. Also, it's bringing in plenty of showers, particularly along North Sea coast, these feeding in inland through the course of the day. The odd shower could be heavy, likely even bringing some snow towards higher ground, particularly across Scotland. The best of the brightness in the west across Northern Ireland, parts of Wales and parts of Devon and Cornwall too, largely seeing a dry day here, and temperatures highs of around 8 to 9 Celsius, but it should still warm and pleasant in the sunshine and in those sheltered spots. Across Scotland, to finish off the day, we're still going to see a fair few showers feeding in from the northeast. Still, once again, the odd shower a little bit heavy and likely seeing snow, mainly to high ground, but a few flurries possible to lower levels. Largely dry across Northern Ireland. They can't rule out a few showers around coastal areas. And across the rest of England and Wales, still a fair few showers, particularly along eastern coasts, but through the course of the evening, most of these easing away. That's away from those North Sea coasts, once again, main firing line for these showers. And this does bring in a risk of ice where we see any wet surfaces, but plenty of clear skies across the south, which means it's going to turn very cold and likely seeing quite a frosty start by the time we reach Friday morning, particularly across parts of the southeast. But overall, it is going to be a cold start for most, even if you don't see any frost to start on Friday. And once again, we're going to see another day with plenty of showers moving through, particularly once again across those eastern coasts and then feeding in through inland through much of the day. Once again, they could be heavy, likely seeing some sleet and snow, particularly as they start to first feed through around coastal areas, and highs around similar, around 8 to 9 Celsius. That's it from me. Bye-bye.
If you want your news to be straight talking...
This is a nightmare for the Conservatives again.
Down to earth.
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
And most importantly, honest.
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them.
Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Headliners on GB News 11 p.m. every night. It's got 3 top comedians going through the next day's newspapers so you don't have to read them, which is great.
That's a good point.
He's lying. I mean, maybe he's not lying.
That's Headliners every night from 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. as well on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK,
we're ready to keep you up to date with what's happening every half an hour, every single day. Bulletins here on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Welcome back to Good Afternoon Britain. It's coming up to 10 to 2 and you've been sending in your views to GB News Your Say.
Yes, Noel Tomlinson says, please, GB News, will you point out to your viewers Hull, from where Starmer was making his speech today, is a vibrant, friendly city. Those ranks of sullen-faced people behind him are not representative of Hull folk. Noel, happy to point out your happiness with Hull. And Christina Harford says, the next move in the NHS should be to remove it from the devolved governments. It's not working in Wales. It's always better to work with economies of scale. Thanks both. Please do get in touch with your views, gbnews.com/your say.
That is an interesting point. The NHS has been under direct political control in Wales for a few years and it's not going well, according to local residents. Anyway, moving on. Some of Britain's most famous piers are facing an uphill battle to attract visitors near and far.
Now, this comes as national insurance and energy price hikes are on the horizon following Labour's controversial autumn budget.
Well, joining us from Bournemouth is Adam Cherry, but first of all, from Southport, we've got Sophie Reaper.
Good afternoon to you both. Drink it in, this beautiful site, this feat of Victorian engineering behind me, which has stood for over 150 years. It's the second longest pier in the UK, and it's a location that is often intrinsically linked with the seaside town of Southport. However, it has now been closed for the past 27 months. December 2022, Sefton Council made the decision to close it for temporary essential maintenance work, and yet it still hasn't reopened, and that is something that people here in Southport and the wider area are really unhappy with. This is something we've been asking today whilst we've been here in Southport, and this is what the people have had to tell me.
I'm for Western-super-Mare. We've got 2 piers, and that brings a hell of a lot of footfall to the town, especially on bank holidays and then some of the kids are off. Well, it's one of the big attractions to seaside towns is the piers, so it's quite disappointing to come here and you can't go on the pier because that is one of the places you can go.
And what about yourself? How important is it that we support our piers all around the UK, not just here in Southport?
Very important indeed. It's part of our British
traditions, the British holiday tradition.
The time that it's been closed and the amount of money initially spent on it, and they're not doing anything about it. And it's a useful asset which is going to waste. It could be bringing tourist money into the resort. It isn't because it's closed. Why? Incompetence.
Seaside towns, they play a huge part in our heritage, and I think there's not been a huge amount of investment. If you look at Blackpool, I think it's lacked investment, and I think it's a shame. And I think Southport seems to be going the same kind of way.
We used to come here quite a lot. We haven't been for a few years. One of the reasons is because that is closed. My son and I love to cycle, but we also bring the grandchild down. And we go down there to the penny slot machines, and the thing's closed. The town's a wee bit run down at parts as well. But I mean, it's still a lovely place. It's beautiful.
Lovely place, Adam Cherry, but it's closed in Southport. How's it going down in Bournemouth?
Afternoon, guys. There's no sunshine, unfortunately, but I am joined by the Chief Operating Officer of Adventure Attractions here on the pier, Pete Collett. Pete, thanks for joining us. Again, no sunshine, but let's move past that. I want to know what it's like to run a business like this. What are the challenges when there is no sunshine, when there aren't that many people around?
Oh, it can be very challenging. I mean, it's fantastic in the summer because our location. You've got 6 Mile, beautiful sandy beach. But then you do have, obviously, in the British climate, it's dealing with when you get days like today and certainly through the winter. The summer's great if the sun comes out. It's so easy, everything works great. Our challenges are when you don't get those sunny periods. And it's the winter periods as well. It's great in the summer, but how do we survive the winters? Going through the winter periods, we operate pretty much most of the winter in negative cash flow.
Right.
And it's trying to retain our teams that we have. We have quite a large management teams right across the pier. And it's then those fluctuations. You can, like, last weekend, great example. So all week it's bad weather, and then all of a sudden at the weekend the sun comes out and bang.
You got to be so responsive, right? Yeah, I understand. Well, Pete, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it live on GB News, guys. Hopefully the next time I see you, there's a little bit more sunshine, but still having a great time here in Bournemouth.
No sunshine, but let's take a look at the weather before we get back to Good Afternoon Britain here on GB News.
A chilly start will give way to a lovely, warm afternoon. Boxed heat pumps, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, good afternoon. Welcome to your GB News weather update from the Met Office. As we head into tomorrow, it's going to be a cold and frosty start, particularly across the south. Then another day of sunshine and showers and fairly similar temperatures too. It is still going to be feeling chilly, all thanks to this very cold northerly flow stretching its way across the country. And not only is it bringing in some chilly weather, it's also bringing in plenty of showers. Once again, plenty across North Sea coasts, feeding inland as we head through the overnight period. A chance we could see the odd heavier shower, likely seeing some snow showers too, particularly across Scotland. And it's going to be another cold night for all, particularly across parts of the south and southeast. A few clearer skies here, so likely seeing quite a sharp frost, particularly across the southeast. So likely you'll be scraping your car by the time you reach the morning. Then across Scotland to start the day tomorrow, perhaps some brighter spells across the west, so some patchy frost here, but in eastern areas still some showers feeding through around coasts, still once again bringing some snow mainly to higher ground. A largely dry and bright start across Northern Ireland, though once again can't rule out a few coastal showers, and plenty of cloud, a mix of showers, some of these bringing once again some snow to higher ground. Southern parts of Wales, for example, could see some snow across the hills, and as I say, feeling rather cold and frosty across parts of the southeast. And then we see a fairly similar day, a mix of showers and some brighter spells. Once again, the showers mostly feeding in around eastern coasts, a few bubbling up inland by the time we reach the afternoon, and still a chance one or two could be heavy and still bringing some sleet and snow to higher ground, but fairly similar temperatures, highs of around 8 to 9 Celsius across the south. Then into the evening, we see a build of higher pressure. That should kill off most of the showers. Still could see one or two in eastern areas, but once again, under any clear skies, turning cold and likely to see some frost. Into next week, it is still going to be feeling chilly, but it should be largely dry with some bright or sunny spells at times. That's it from me. Bye-bye.
A nice bright morning will generate a lovely warm day, right through to the evening. Boxed Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
You
could have £17,777 in tax-free cash to play with this spring. Cash to spend on anything you like. And if that wasn't enough, we're also going to give you not one, but two sought-after designer watches and the latest Mulberry handbag. How would winning that sound? For a chance to win the cash, 2 watches and the designer bag, text cash to 63232. One entry costs £2 plus 1 standard network rate message, or text bonus to 63232. 5 entries cost £5 plus 1 standard network rate message. Go to gbnews.com/win. Entries start from just £2. Call 0903 681 3232. Calls cost £2 plus your network access charge, or post your name and number to GB12 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 6 p.m. on the 4th of April. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
It's Patrick Christie's Tonight, and here we do things differently.
It's explaining the absolute madness of this, doesn't it?
It's explosive.
I mean, this is very good.
It's lively.
850. Your government sat there, Sean, and it did nothing.
It's controversial.
And the Middle East has been in turmoil since before I was born.
It's everything you need to kickstart your evening.
Everyone's had their Weetabix tonight. I love to see it.
That's Patrick Christie's Tonight, weeknights from 9 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Mornings don't have to be tiresome, especially if you have the right company.
Wake up to news as it happens, opinion and debate, and of course, a little bit of entertainment too.
Because when the kettle's on, we're on.
That's Breakfast on GB News, a show worth waking up for.
Every morning from 6 a.m.
Only on the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We'll spread the news, you spread the word.
If you want your news to be straight talking,
This is a nightmare for the Conservatives again.
down to earth,
It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it?
and most importantly, honest,
Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get the book thrown at them.
then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akwe, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
No, he didn't say that, Dave.
I'm so surprised.
I think there's an element of truth to that.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Headliners on GB News 11 p.m. every night. It's got 3 top comedians going through the next day's newspapers so you don't have to read them, which is great.
That's a good point.
He's lying. I mean, maybe he's not lying.
That's Headliners every night from 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. as well on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 2 o'clock on Thursday, the 13th of March. I'm Miriam Cates.
And I'm Charlie Peters. Now, the father, stepmother and uncle of murdered schoolgirl Sara Sharif are appealing against sentences handed down to them in 2024.
Yes, and the court has also heard an application by the Attorney General for leave to refer to the sentence of Sara's father, Irfan Sharif, as unduly lenient, arguing he should have received a whole life order.
Now, we're now joined in the studio by GB News' Home and Security Editor, Mark White, who's been following the proceedings in the court today. Mark, what has been discussed in the morning session at the court?
Well, it's quite a complex thing, as these Court of Appeal decisions and hearings often are, in that it's going to roll up a number of different appeals. There are appeals separately from all 3 of those who were convicted for their involvement in Sara Sharif's murder, but they're also considering an appeal on behalf of the Solicitor General in the case or the sentence handed down to Irfan Sharif. He was, remember, sentenced for the murder of Sara Sharif to life in prison with a minimum tariff of 40 years. So he has to spend at least 40 years in prison before he is eligible for consideration for parole. The Solicitor General says they believe that sentence was unduly lenient, and they are appealing for a whole life tariff. They say because of the exceptional circumstances surrounding the horrific way in which this 10-year-old girl was treated, year after year of systematic abuse that resulted really in a young girl being tortured to death, that is so exceptional that it should bring with it a whole life tariff. And as I say, alongside, these are kind of a rolled up hearing alongside that Solicitor General's appeal for a whole life tariff. You've got Sara Sharif himself, who is calling for his sentence with that 40-year minimum tariff to be reduced, saying that that was too strict and too heavy a sentence. And we've also got Banish Batul, who was his partner, who was also convicted of murder, who was given a minimum tariff of 33 years. 33 years that she must serve in prison before she can even be considered for parole. Her legal team have been arguing that actually that didn't take into account the fact that although she was convicted of murder, her role in what happened was very much a secondary role. So they are saying that it was too harsh, that sentence handed down. They are asking for a more lenient sentence. And then, of course, you've got Faisal Malik, who's the uncle of Sara Sharif as well, who was sentenced to life with a minimum of 16 years for his part in causing or assisting the death of a child.
And Mark, I was in the courtroom before this sentencing. There was cheers in the public gallery when those sentences were handed down, and there was no reaction whatsoever from those three defendants. And during the trial, there was a dramatic moment when Banish Batul and Sara Sharif had turned on each other during the proceedings, blamed each other for Sara Sharif's death and indeed murder. But there was a moment suddenly when Sara Sharif sort of cracked under the pressure of questioning and admitted his involvement. Do you feel as though the legal challenge from Banish Batul, the stepmother, is that that hasn't been taken into account sufficiently? He accepted responsibility, but she's got 33 years.
Yeah, rats in a sack, isn't it? You remember, of course, the family as well fled over to Pakistan in the wake of that murder with the father, Sara Sharif, calling and trying to claim that she had died, but it was nothing to do with him in the sense that he had only given her a mild beating. But yes, you're right, in the way in which they turned on each other. But all of that will probably be secondary to what the judges will be weighing up in terms of the role that they played in the death of Sara Sharif, and as far as Banish Batul is concerned, whether they accept the fact that actually her role was very much a secondary role, or whether they actually believe that the trial judge got it right on, her sentence and the sentence of the father of Sara Sharif as well, in saying that this was tantamount to torture that took place not just over weeks or months, but years. When that little girl's body was found, she had 71 fresh injuries on her body, including 25 broken bones.
I just want to say, Mark, what the pictures we're showing now are showing a tool of Sara Sharif's abuse. It's a photo of her wearing a hijab that was used to cover up her injuries. And one of the reasons why Banish Batul received that extensive punishment, that 33-year term, is because she helped to keep Sara Sharif in a hijab, which teachers saw bruises to her chin, but then would also very soon after see her wearing this head covering. And Surrey police are actually criticised quite extensively at the sentencing because they released a photo, their official photo they released on the news of the sentencing was of Sara Sharif wearing that tool of her abuse, the covering which contributed to many more months of her suffering that led eventually to her murder.
Yes, it was one of the very calculated ways in which the father and others involved in the murder of this young girl were able to cover that up for much longer, as you say, and allow that abuse to continue. The abuse, as I say, that resulted not just in the 25 broken bones among those 71 fresh injuries, but many burns on her body caused by a hot iron, scalding on her feet, as well as human bites. I mean, it's just absolutely sickening to contemplate what they subjected this young girl to, and that's why the Solicitor General is arguing here that really this is a wholly exceptional case. I should say that Irfan Sharif's legal team are saying it's not a wholly exceptional case, that, you know, as horrific as it is, sadly, this kind of crime is all too common, and they're saying it should not then carry with it that whole life tariff. This will be for the Lady Chief Justice, alongside two other judges, sitting to decide on whether, first of all, they accept the appeals that are being put forward by the individuals, the three who were convicted, and of course the Solicitor General. Should say we're waiting for that decision to be handed down of the Court of Appeal. No sign of it yet, but as soon as it comes, we'll certainly bring that to you.
And even if Irfan Sharif's tariff is not extended, it's unlikely he will ever leave prison anyway with a tariff of 40 years.
Well, indeed.
Unless it's...
well, I mean, it depends how long he lives. He's in his 40s at the moment, so he could conceivably live long enough, but we just await to see what that tariff will be.
He's in his 40s and he's also struggling to keep safe in prison as well. Reported 2 months ago that he'd been attacked very brutally. He was lucky to survive after an attack barely weeks into his arrival in prison. But, yeah, we'll go to that on the Live Court of Appeal when we can.
Mark White, thank you very much. And as Charlie said, we will be bringing you that sentencing live. Well, on to other news of today. The NHS England is going to be abolished.
So today I can announce we're going to cut bureaucracy across the state, focus government on the priorities of working people, shift money to the front line. So I'm bringing management of the NHS back into democratic control by abolishing the arm's-length body NHS England. That will put the NHS back at the heart of government where it belongs, freeing it to focus on patients, less bureaucracy, with more money for nurses, an NHS refocused on cutting waiting times at your hospital.
Now, the Prime Minister made the announcement as part of his so-called plan for change, which involves tackling what he has called Britain's flabby, unfocused and overcautious state.
However, Sir Keir Starmer's comments on the state of Whitehall have already sparked a serious backlash from trade unions, who've branded his plans unrealistic and insulting. Well, here to tell us more is GB News political editor Christopher Hope. Chris, wide-ranging reaction to these plans. How do you think this will play out over the next few days?
Well, it's extraordinary. No one thought he was going to come here to Hull and announce the axing of the world's biggest quango. It's called NHS England, and since around 2012, when the NHS was carved out away from ministerial control and given to this quango, successive health ministers under the Tory government have moaned to me repeatedly how they can't actually control the health budget, but they're blamed for everything going wrong. Well, Sir Keir Starmer is doing something about that. He is stripping away the powers of that quango and bringing it all under one man, Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary. This is not without risk. Until now, health issues are blamed on health trusts, on other groups and hospitals, but not the actual ministers properly, although they are in charge, of course, of overall policy. Now it's all on Wes Streeting, you know, a bureaucracy of well over 1 million people under his control. Fascinating and brave, I think, by this government. Sir Keir Starmer said in question and answer session up at Reckitt, which is Gaviscon and other indigestion products, that kind of thing. he said in terms that he doesn't understand why there's two different policy units at NHS England and in Department of Health and two communications teams. And all this duplication costs money and he can't get people treated quick enough. And he said he's doing something about that. We don't want a bigger state, he said. They're stripping away red tape. A wider speech here about bringing AI more into public services, ditching red tape that stops new homes being built. I asked him a question for GB News, though, which I know concerns many of our viewers and listeners, and it was simply this: if you want to spend more money on taxpayers rather than a civil service, will you axe these woke schemes, the DEI, diversity, inclusion and equity policies, and put taxpayers first? And here's what the PM had to say earlier.
Every pound has to be spent rightly. Every pound we have at our disposal as a government is not our money, it's taxpayer money, it's your money. It's money that people have put in expecting the government to use it properly and wisely. And we must keep that in mind with every decision that we make. And that's why we're making the announcements that we make today. We're not slashing our commitment to equality and important issues like that. Nobody would expect that. But we are making sure we're stripping away what is unnecessary.
Now, the context here is everything. He's taking essentially an Elon Musk-sized chainsaw to parts of government spending. His unions may not like it. There may be job losses in NHS offices around the country, but he wants to put the interest of patients first, and that is to be commended. Next week, he's axing maybe £6 billion off the welfare budget. 2 weeks ago, he cut the aid budget and spent the money on defence. In a sense, he's stealing the clothes of another party, Reform UK. I wonder what Nigel Farage might think about this. While they battle over who's in charge and have a rather silly row with each other about who's most important in the party, Keir Starmer's nicking their clothes.
Well, Chris Hope, we've heard from Dave Penman, the General Secretary of the FDA, the Civil Service Union, saying that the idea that they're going to be able to cut staffing with this method is for the birds. He says, if you're going to cut staffing in half, the idea that you're going to do that because there are just two comms teams is just for the birds. Have you heard from Wes Streeting or anyone else in Labour about what else might be cut?
We haven't heard yet. I think, Dave Penman runs the FDA, the First Division Association, which is a trade union that speaks up for exactly the kind of thing, the kind of people who Sir Keir Starmer's got in his eye line. So he would say that, wouldn't he? But I think, frankly, to hear a Prime Minister squarely put the interests of ill people first against the interests of civil servants or unions is to be commended. I think here's somebody who, these are tough choices. They won't be popular amongst his union supporters, but he may well get the electoral benefit and may even push him towards what seemed unlikely a few weeks ago, but a second-term Labour government.
Chris, thank you very much for that report. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the next few weeks. Of course, if we're going to grow our economy, we need to move jobs from the public sector to the private sector. So perhaps this is exactly what we need.
Well, moving on to another big discussion. Britain's equality watchdog has warned that a so-called two-tier justice plan is unfair to white men, with the Sentencing Council refusing to back down over its proposal to give special treatment to ethnic minorities and transgender people who are convicted of crimes.
It has also rejected repeated requests by Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood to rethink the guidelines, meaning that from next month, courts will have to order pre-sentence reports for minority groups, making it more likely that they will be spared jail.
Well, let's discuss this further with Alka Segal-Cuthbert, the director of Don't Divide Us. Alka, I feel as though these guidelines have really caught Labour off guard. Do you think that they're doing enough to take back momentum and get on track with this debate?
Well, I was hopeful for a moment when Shabana Mahmood came out and condemned them quite unequivocally, but I believe she has not supported the bill brought by Robert Jenrick to stop that aspect of the guidelines immediately. And it's a shame because these guidelines, the logic of these guidelines is that the guidelines are unnecessary, and I think their inner logic is inherently divisive and discriminatory. What they're doing is endorsing and extending a special provisions approach in sentencing. And what this does, it means that the numerical majority, who happen to be white in Britain, will not get those special provisions when any report is done because of their ethnicity, which is white British. So it is disadvantaging white people in that indirect way. But, you know, more importantly, it's fueling a very, very, very divisive and I think dangerous cultural trend, which is to encourage us to see ourselves as communal group members rather than as individuals. And the law, the universal principle of the law that has been accepted for so long is that, you know, as an individual, you stand as an equal before the law. And that's underpins the idea of, you know, sentencing and applying justice without fear or favour. And these guidelines are really taking another step away from that universal principle.
Now, Alka, a lot of these initiatives, this one in the justice system and many others that we can think of in other public services, have been designed, in theory, to reduce discrimination and to put people on a level playing field. But what you're explaining to us is that actually it's done the opposite by focusing on people's differences, and now we're in the position where we're no longer equal under the law.
That's right. We're no longer... Not only is it kind of... is it legal nonsense in legal terms, but in terms of the problems that they're trying to address, this whole outlook actually obscures. It makes it more difficult to understand what they really are. You know, usually people say, well, look at the figures. You can see that, you know, more, you know, X% of black people get higher sentences, for example, or you know, get longer prison sentences. As if that fact alone could be attributed to race discrimination, when actually there are other structures. You know, there might be other important reasons, social, political, socio-cultural reasons, that are just attention is just kind of diverted away from looking at those things. They could be anything, and you know, anything from, you know, tradition, a historic suspicion of authority amongst some sections of ethnic minorities, not all by any means. It could be the kind of subculture of certain young, in certain communities of young black men predominantly, for whom this kind of, I think my colleague Tony Sewell has made this point, that you know, some young men who are in knife stabbings, for example, when they appear in the court, it's like they genuinely do not see that they've done anything wrong, because for them, stabbing is part of their kind of subcultural code of honour. And you know, you can understand that, but when it comes to applying justice, the same rules have to apply. And we would be better off looking at, if that is the case, then that tells us our society is not offering other more constructive forms of honour, of you know, means of channeling, particularly young black men's energies and desire for esteem. That's not a liberal argument. That's just an argument for, let's just look at what actually might be the real problems and keep the law as it should be, as most people in Britain agree it should be, based upon universal principles and not multicultural particularist principles.
Alka Segal Cuthbert, thank you so much. Director of Don't Divide Us. This debate, I'm sure, will roll on. But we are going to go back to the Court of Appeal live for this hearing on the Sara Sharif murder trial sentencing appeal.
Sara was tied up. She was trussed up with masking tape and skipping rope and hooded. Plastic bags were put over her head, held in place with masking tape, a hole being ripped in the plastic bag so that she could breathe. When the bins at the house were examined after her death, the police found a soiled nappy wrapped around her leggings, evidence that Sharif and Batul were putting her in pull-up nappies because they were not allowing her to go to the toilet whilst she was trussed up. Moreover, the medical evidence showed that Sara had been left in her own urine and faeces, with restraints so tight that her feet and ankles were pulled up so that they were in contact with her bottom. She was underweight, she was undernourished. The cause of death was complications arising from multiple injuries and neglect suffered cumulatively, not specific to a single injury or incident. In the early evening of the 8th of August 2023, a Tuesday, Batul saw that Sara was very unwell. She called Sharif asking him to come home. When he returned, Sara was floppy in Batul's arms. Sharif proceeded to beat her vigorously with a metal pole on her abdomen for pretending to be ill. A few moments later, she died. Malik was in the house at the time. The three adults did not call for an ambulance nor the police. Rather, they made immediate preparations to flee to Pakistan with a view to abandoning Sara's body in the house. Indeed, within less than an hour of her death, they were arranging flights to Pakistan for the rest of the family. They then took steps to cover up what they had done. Sara's body was washed, put in clean clothes, placed on a bed. Her leggings, the nappy she was wearing, the masking tape, the hoods were put in bins. The metal pole was hidden in an outbuilding. Malik's McDonald's uniform was found partly in and partly next to the bins, alongside the other items, and part of the uniform was soaking wet. Sharif removed the Ring doorbell to hide any video evidence, and he left a note on Sara's body saying, "Whoever sees this note, it's me, Irfan Sharif, who killed my daughter by beating. I am running away because I'm scared, but I promise that I will hand over myself and take punishment." The following morning, Sharif, Batul and Malik drove the remaining children to Heathrow. They stopped on the way for Sharif and Batul to withdraw substantial sums of money in cash before fleeing to Pakistan. Upon their arrival at Islamabad, Sharif rang Surrey police, saying he had killed his daughter. Her body could be found at the house. He said tearfully, "I did legally punish my daughter and she died." He said he intended to hand himself in, but did not tell the police where he was. They all then went into hiding in Pakistan. On the 6th of September 2023, Sharif and Batul took part in a video press statement in which they referred only briefly to Sara, saying it was a, quote, incident, and then spent the rest of the time complaining about the pressure under which they were from the Pakistani authorities. On the 13th of September 2023, Sharif, Batul and Malik flew back to the United Kingdom. They were arrested on arrival and interviewed, all declining to answer questions in police interview. Sharif was 43 years old at the time of conviction, with one previous conviction in 2013 for an offence of employer theft. Batul was aged 30 at the time of conviction. She had previous convictions for two offences of theft and making a false representation. Malik was 29 years old at the time of conviction, with no previous convictions or cautions. Sara was a little girl full of personality, a beautiful, brave, feisty and spirited child who adored her younger brother. Her teacher described her as bubbly, confident, chatty and engaging, and she loved to sing and dance. The sentence. The judge proceeded to sentence without any pre-sentence report, and we agree that none was necessary. In careful and well-structured sentencing remarks, he described the campaign of abuse against Sara as torture and said that none of the applicants had shown a shred of true remorse. At trial, Sharif had blamed Batul for Sara's injuries until it became clear that his description of events simply had no credibility. He then asserted that he had not intended to cause any injury to Sara and that his admitted assaults were not the cause of her death. Malik and Batul remained silent at trial and had made no effort to accept any responsibility for their offending. Sharif. The judge stated that Sharif's offending did not come within the class of offending for which a whole life order would be appropriate. The way that Sharif treated Sara, culminating in her murder, was of such seriousness, however, as to warrant a 30-year starting point. Even if the word sadistic was not precisely apt to describe the offending, which did not fall with any of the specific examples in Schedule 21, for which a starting point of 30 years for the minimum term was appropriate, that list was not exhaustive. Sharif had plainly derived grim satisfaction from his campaign of violence against Sara. The judge then identified 3 statutory and 14 non-statutory aggravating factors. Statutory aggravating factors were Sara's particular vulnerability due to her age, the fact that she suffered extreme mental and physical suffering, mainly at the hands of Sharif. The assaults, which went on for 4 years, were accompanied by other acts of cruelty, which meant that Sara must have been in a constant state of terror. Sharif took Sara out of school to conceal what he had done. In the last few weeks, Sara was tied up, hooded, left to wallow in her own urine and faeces and tortured. Thirdly, abuse of trust, though the judge bore in mind the overlap between the abuse of a position of trust and Sara's vulnerability. As for non-statutory aggravating factors, Sara had been singled out as a female child who was not Batul's child. Weapons and restraints had been used, and the assaults took place in front of or within the hearing of other children. When Sara was close to death, Sharif did not call an ambulance or seek medical help. He beat her with a metal rod. Following her murder, he fled abroad, went into hiding, then denied everything until 6 days into his evidence at trial. He disposed of evidence. He sought to blame Batul, which the judge described as a major aggravating factor. He had a history of preying on vulnerable women and had shown no real remorse, but was suffused with self-pity. The judge said the previous conviction was of no relevance. Whilst he had been careful to avoid double counting, a sentence of 30 years would not reflect the gravity of Sharif's offending. There was very little by way of mitigation. The judge accepted that Sharif did not intend to kill Sara, but this was scant mitigation in the circumstances. Batul. The judge said that Batul's involvement consisted mainly of encouraging and assisting Sharif in his assaults. She valued Sara less than her other children and was prepared to sacrifice Sara in fear of losing her other children. Batul had taken an active part in some of the maltreatment of Sara, biting her on the arm and inner thigh shortly before she died, taking part in the tying up and hooding of Sara. The judge had no doubt that Batul was involved in the burning of Sara with an iron. She sincerely expressed horror and concern in the early stages of Sharif's treatment of Sara, but did nothing about it and became complicit in it. The judge said that her conduct was of such seriousness as to warrant a 30-year starting point. The judge then identified the same statutory aggravating factors as for Sharif, with the same caution about overlap and the need to avoid double counting. As for non-statutory aggravating features, he identified the singling out of Sara for ill treatment as a female with a different mother, the use of weapons and restraints, the fact that the assaults took place in front of or within the hearing of other children, the deliberate concealment of the maltreatment, the failure to seek medical help, the fleeing to Pakistan, the abandoning of Sara's body, the disposal of evidence, the uprooting of her other children and stepchild from their home, and the lack of credible remorse. The judge then identified the following mitigating features, which he described as, quote, significant. Batul was not the prime mover in the assaults. Her role was a secondary one of assisting and encouraging Sharif, and she did display the occasional act of kindness towards Sara. Batul was in a coercive and controlling relationship. Sharif was considerably older, and she felt under pressure to obey him and follow his lead. She was vulnerable when they met, and was the occasional victim of abuse by Sharif. She was under a great deal of strain as essentially the sole carer of 6 children in a flat and a house, which were each far too small. The twins had challenging behaviour. She had had a difficult, strict and religious upbringing. She had been disowned by her own father, had a medical history of depression, and was effectively of good character. However, the judge said the impact of the mitigation was limited. Batul had a strong character and could have stood up to Sharif in relation to his treatment of Sara. She should have taken steps to stop the torture of Sara, but instead took a positive decision not to seek help. She had not intended to kill Sara, but this again was scant mitigation. Malik. The judge stated that Malik's offending consisted of failing to take reasonable steps to protect Sara from the risk of physical harm being caused to her by the unlawful acts of Sharif and Batul. There was no evidence that Malik had played an active part in the ill treatment of Sara, but he could not have failed to have been aware of much of the terrible ill treatment, yet he stood by and did nothing. He was present for and well aware of a substantial number of the assaults on Sara during his time with the family. The judge placed the offending in category 1A with very high culpability and with a starting point of 14 years imprisonment and a range of 12 to 18 years imprisonment. The judge said that Malik's failure to protect Sara was extreme. The judge identified as aggravating factors the prolonged and exceptional suffering endured by Sara, recognising the need to avoid double counting, the fact that the offences were committed in the presence of other children, the failure to seek medical help, the fact that Malik had helped the family to flee to Pakistan, the disposal of important evidence on Malik's mobile telephone, and the lack of remorse. As mitigating features, the judge identified Malik's previous good character and the fact that much of the abuse took place before Malik arrived in the United Kingdom. The judge concluded that Malik did not meet the criteria for dangerousness. Grounds of appeal against sentence. Sharif. It is accepted for Sharif that whilst not falling within any of the non-exhaustive categories identified in paragraph 3.2 of Schedule 21, the judge was entitled to take 30 years as a notional starting point before considering aggravating features. The first ground of appeal is that the judge must have double counted some of the aggravating features. Mr. Meehan, King's Counsel, submits that having taken the 30-year starting point because of the nature of the overall offending, the court had to be astute to avoid double counting. Whilst the sentencing remarks show that the judge was alive to the risk, in the results it is suggested that he failed to avoid it. It is said by reference to the 3 statutory and 11 non-statutory aggravating factors which the judge identified, the judge in effect double counted. The mental and physical suffering inflicted on Sara before death, the singling out of Sara amongst his children for harsh treatment, the use of weapons, restraints, the particular conduct on the 8th of August. The judge, Mr. Meehan, submits that the uplift to 40 years can only be explained on the basis of inadvertent double counting. In summary, it is suggested that the pre-death conduct relied upon by the judge in order to reach a starting point of 30 years could not be used in any way as an aggravating feature to lift the term above 30 years. The second ground of appeal is that the judge took into account matters which should not have been treated as aggravating factors and/or gave such factors undue weight. So it is said to have been wrong to treat as aggravating factors the uprooting of the other children, the placing of blame on Batul, and the lack of remorse. As to the uprooting, this presupposed without supportive evidence that they would have been better off here, almost certainly split up from each other, rather than with their family in Pakistan. As for blame on Batul, it's said to have been wrong to treat this as a major aggravating factor. Placing blame on others was capable of being such a factor, but this was typically in circumstances where the blame is being placed on an innocent person. As to remorse, its presence was a mitigating factor, its absence was not an aggravating one. Finally, it is suggested that the judge failed to give sufficient weight to the mitigating factor of absence of intent to kill. The combined result of these errors is suggested to have resulted in a manifestly excessive minimum term of 40 years. Batul. On behalf of Batul, Ms Carberry, King's Counsel, does not challenge the judge's starting point of 30 years, but submits that once selected, that term should have been the ceiling of the minimum term, not its floor. She submits, firstly, that the judge failed sufficiently to recognise that Batul's culpability was significantly less than that of Sharif, and secondly, that the judge laid too much weight on aggravating factors and too little weight on mitigating factors. As to culpability, Ms Carberry points to the fact that Batul had a secondary role only in the assaults. It is suggested that having accepted that Batul was not the prime mover in the assaults on Sara, The judge then undermined that mitigation by going on to state that she did take part in inflicting some horrible injuries on Sara. Further, it is suggested that the judge wrongly identified that Batul had sometimes participated in acts of extreme cruelty over a long period, when Batul's participation had only taken place towards the end of the campaign. As for aggravating features, it is suggested again, as with Sharif, that whilst the judge clearly had the risk of double counting in mind, he failed to avoid the trap and must have double counted aggravating features in relation to mental and physical suffering, the use of weapons and the use of restraints. As for mitigating factors, too little weight, it is suggested, was placed on Batul's history of domestic abuse within the childhood home, honour-based abuse in her teenage years and isolation from her family, lack of support, guidance or advice from her family, and extreme cultural pressure being placed on Batul. Ms Carberry emphasises that Batul was only 20 when she met Sharif, a man 13 years her senior, and had a history of depression. It is also suggested that the judge failed to place adequate weight on the absence of an intent to kill. The first ground of appeal builds on the the final ground of appeal builds on the first and second, and contends that the minimum term should have been reduced below the 30-year starting point, and accordingly the term of 33 years was manifestly excessive. Ms Carberry, in writing, sought to support these submissions by reference to a number of other cases considered by this court, seeking to draw a contrast between the minimum terms there imposed and the present. We say immediately that we have not been assisted by the citation of these cases. The attempt to draw on supposed similarities and distinctions to and from the present case has not been relevant, when each case is inevitably and particularly dependent on its own facts and circumstances. It is simply not a useful exercise. Malik. It is submitted for Malik that his sentence was manifestly excessive for the following reasons. First, that the judge adopted too high a category within the relevant Sentencing Council guideline. The categorisation should have been 1B, towards the top of the range, and not category 1A. Secondly, it is said that Malik should be sentenced only for what he could be proved to have known or witnessed, not on that which he could not. Thirdly, and in extension, it is said that the judge accepted that Malik had not himself caused any injury to the deceased, and that should have reduced his sentence further. Fourthly, it is suggested that many of the aggravating factors of seriousness did not apply to Malik, but they were nevertheless taken into account against him. Fifthly, the criticism is that the judge failed to draw a distinction that Malik did not cause Sara's death, he only allowed it. Sixthly, reliance is placed on the suggestion that if the sentences of Sharif and Batul are to be reduced, then so should the sentence of Malik. In the course of his oral submissions, Mr Ivers, King's Counsel, emphasised in particular that the nature of Malik's offending, namely that it was allowing rather than causing the death of Sara, was not taken into account adequately. Furthermore, the nature of the allowing was not to be treated as extreme as, for example, might be the case where active steps are taken by an offender to conceal the offending in question. Grounds of opposition. In summary, it is said that none of the sentences imposed in this case can properly be described as manifestly excessive. The judge who heard the lengthy trial was right to describe Sara's death as the culmination of years of neglect, frequent assaults and torture. The judge's approach to sentencing had regard to the relevant sentencing framework in relation to each applicant, based upon the judge's assessment of the facts as he found them to be. It is submitted that none of the grounds raised are arguable. Reference under Section 36 of the Criminal Justice Act 1988. The Solicitor General submits that the judge was wrong not to impose a whole life order on the offender. The Solicitor General recognises the advantage of the trial judge in assessing seriousness of the offending. It is emphasised that Schedule 21 is, however, not a straitjacket. There must come a point at which the balance tips in favour of a whole life order, even if the facts do not strictly fit the non-exhaustive examples given in Schedule in paragraph 2. This was, it is said, a truly awful case of the murder of the child. Given the judge's findings of fact as to the extent, the nature and the duration of the offending, this was a case, it is suggested, where only a whole life order could be imposed. It is said that the judge dealt only briefly with this issue when he could and should have said more as to why he was not imposing a whole life order, given the findings of fact that he was making. It is suggested that it is difficult to conceive of a murder being perpetrated on a young girl by her own father that could be any more serious. There was not an intention to kill, but the judge, it is suggested, rightly regarded that as scant mitigation. The categories it is emphasised by Mr Little, King's Counsel for the Solicitor General in Schedule 21, paragraph 2.2 are not exhaustive. And it is difficult, in the alternative, to see in principle why a case that merits the description of torture should be regarded as less serious, for example, than a murder involving sadistic conduct. Such sadistic conduct can be relatively short-lived and still meet that threshold. Indeed, here, the judge found torture and grim satisfaction on the part of Sharif from his campaign of violence. Having summarised the facts and the respective arguments, we first set out the relevant sentencing framework for murder and then our separate analysis in relation to each applicant. Relevant sentencing framework. By reason of Section 1.1 of the Murder, Abolition of Death Penalty Act 1965, an offender who is convicted of murder must be sentenced to imprisonment for life. However, when imposing a life sentence, it is also necessary for the court to make an order under Section 321 of the Sentencing Act 2020, which by subsection 2 must be a minimum term order, enabling the parole board to consider whether it is no longer necessary for the protection of the public that the offender should be confined after the conclusion of the minimum term, unless the court is required by subsection 3 to make a whole life order, in which case the early release provisions of section 28(5)(8) of the Crime Sentences Act 1997 are not to apply to the offender. In the case of an offender who was aged 21 or over when they committed the offence of murder, the court must make a whole life order if, quote, the court is of the opinion that because of the seriousness of 1, the offence, or 2, the combination of the offence and 1 or more offences associated with it, it should not make a minimum term order. In considering the seriousness of the offence, or a combination of the offence and 1 or more offences associated with it, either for the purposes of determining whether to make a whole life order or determining the minimum term, the court must have regard, under section 322(3) of the 2020 Act, to 1, the general principles set out in Schedule 21, and 2, any sentencing guidelines relating to offences in general which are relevant to the case and not incompatible with the provisions of Schedule 21. Schedule 21 sets out a series of starting points for the court's determination as to whether to impose a whole life order or a minimum term order, and in the latter case, the length of the minimum term. Paragraph 2 of Schedule 21 provides for the circumstances in which the starting point is a whole life order, materially as follows. Quote, 2.1, if A, the court considers that the seriousness of the offence ... is exceptionally high, and B, the offender was aged 21 or over when the offence was committed, the appropriate starting point is a whole life order. 2. Cases that would normally fall within subparagraph 1A include A, the murder of a child involving a substantial degree of premeditation or planning, where the offence was committed on or after the day on which Section 125 of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 22 came into force, in square brackets, 28th of June 2022. Paragraph 3 of Schedule 21 provides for the circumstances in which the starting point for the minimum term is 30 years, namely, cases involving offenders aged 18 or over when the offence is committed where the court considers the seriousness of the offence to be particularly high. Cases normally falling within paragraph 3 include cases of murder involving sadistic conduct. Paragraphs 7 to 11 of Schedule 21 make provision in respect of aggravating and mitigating factors. Having chosen a starting point, the court should take into account any aggravating or mitigating factors to the extent that it has not allowed for them in its choice of starting point. Detailed consideration of aggravating or mitigating factors may result in a minimum term of any length, whatever the starting point, or in the making of a whole life order. Aggravating factors include a significant degree of planning or premeditation, the fact that the victim was particularly vulnerable because of age, mental or physical suffering inflicted on the victim before death, the abuse of a position of trust. Mitigating factors include an intention to cause serious bodily harm rather than to kill. The principles relating to whole life orders have been considered recently and authoritatively by the Court in Crown against Stewart and others, 2022, EWCA Crim 1063, where Lord Burnett of Malden, Chief Justice, reviewed the statutory provisions and the relevant authorities, summarising the relevant principles at paragraph 19, which we do not need to rehearse here. The parties, during the course of written and oral submissions, referred us to various authorities, including the case of Tustin, which falls within the judgment in Stewart and others, and also Crown against Lennon, 2024, EWCA Crim 719. Even a cursory comparison of the facts of those cases reveals multiple material differences, confirming that there is in reality no useful illumination or guidance to be derived from them for our purposes. Analysis: Sharif. We take the Solicitor General's application for leave to refer first. Whilst the prosecution did not press for a whole life order, it did leave open the possibility of such an outcome, both in their written note on sentence and orally at the sentencing hearing. In any event, any concession by the prosecution at first instance is no bar to the law officers seeking to contend that the judge's was wrong and duly lenient. But the prosecution approach may, of course, be relevant to whether it was unduly lenient not to impose a whole life order. As identified in Stewart at paragraph 19, a whole life order is a sentence of last resort for cases of the most extreme gravity, reserved for the few exceptionally serious cases where the judge is satisfied that the element of just punishment requires the imposition of a whole life order. The case must be exceptionally serious, even in the context of a murder case. If the judge is in any doubt as to whether this standard is reached, that may itself well be an indication that a finite minimum term is the appropriate disposal. To be imprisoned for a period of 30 years or more is a very severe penalty. Further, as identified in Stewart at paragraph 81, in some cases, probably rare, the seriousness of the offending may be regarded as exceptionally high, even though the circumstances of the case do not fall within one of the criteria set out in paragraph 2.2 of Schedule 21. The criteria are not exhaustive. It is common ground here that Sharif's offending did not fall strictly within any of the criteria. As set out above, the gist of the Solicitor General's argument is that Sharif's offending can and should properly be equated with two of the criteria in paragraph 2.2 of Schedule 21, and that accordingly anything less than a whole life order was unduly lenient. We recognise the force of the analogy drawn. The use of repeated, routine, serious violence on a child over such a lengthy period bears comparison with a single act of premeditated lethal violence, amounting to the murder of a child involving a substantial degree of premeditation or planning. Further, Sharif's conduct, described by the judge as a campaign of abuse amounting to torture, from which he obtained grim satisfaction, could be said to be of no less gravity than the murder of a child involving sadistic conduct. As the Solicitor General points out, in the latter case, the conduct, unlike in the present case, may be short-lived. But we are not persuaded that anything less than a whole life order was unduly lenient. The judge considered the imposition of a whole life order and judged it to be inappropriate. The fact that he did not give detailed reasons for his conclusion is unsurprising, given the prosecution's lack of emphasis on such an outcome at the sentencing hearing. Whilst the prosecution submitted that the imposition of a whole life order at least merited the court's serious consideration, it went on to submit that the contention that this was a murder of particularly high seriousness was one which could be said sensibly to apply to the particular facts of the case. First, whilst recognising always that the categories identified in paragraph 2.2 are not exhaustive, the facts of this case, terrible as they are, do not fall within those categories. The absence of planning or premeditation to that end does distinguish this case from a planned or premeditated murder. Equally, as the judge found, the case did not fall within the strict category of murder involving sadistic conduct. Further, in this case, there was an intention to cause serious bodily harm rather than to kill, and in this context, that was a material factor. Secondly, as the authorities...
Well, we're joined now in the studio by our Home and Security editor, Mark White. Baroness Carr there, wrapping up her judgment.
Yes, and that judgment is significant. She has denied the appeal put forward by Irfan Sharif, the father of Sara Sharif, and by her stepmother, Binath Batul, as far as the tariffs that were handed down to them, 40-year minimum that they must serve, that Irfan Sharif must serve, 33 minimum for Ms Batul. And with regard to the Solicitor General's appeal again, asking for a whole life tariff, that appeal has been turned down as well. So the Lady Chief Justice there saying that she is not persuaded by the force of the argument from the Solicitor General with regard to that whole life tariff, while accepting a lot of the premise of the argument that they're putting forward about the serious nature of the prolonged violence that this young girl suffered.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. Well, you've been watching Good Afternoon Britain with me, Charlie Peters, and Miriam Cates. Don't go away, because Martin Daubney is up next, and he'll have plenty more stories to take you into the afternoon.
A chilly start will give way to a lovely, warm afternoon. Boxed heat pumps, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, good afternoon. Welcome to your GB News weather update from the Met Office. As we head into tomorrow, it's going to be a cold and frosty start, particularly across the south. Then another day of sunshine and showers and fairly similar temperatures too. It is still going to be feeling chilly, all thanks to this very cold northerly flow stretching its way across the country. And not only is it bringing in some chilly weather, it's also bringing in plenty of showers. Once again, plenty across North Sea coasts, feeding inland as we head through the overnight period. A chance we could see the odd heavier shower, likely seeing some snow showers too, particularly across Scotland. And it's going to be another cold night for all, particularly across parts of the south and southeast. A few clearer skies here, so likely seeing quite a sharp frost, particularly across the southeast. So likely you'll be scraping your car by the time you reach the morning. Then across Scotland to start the day tomorrow. Perhaps some brighter spells across the west, so some patchy frost here. But in eastern areas, still some showers feeding through around coasts, still once again bringing some snow mainly to higher ground. A largely dry and bright start across Northern Ireland, though once again can't rule out a few coastal showers. And plenty of cloud, a mix of showers, some of these bringing once again some snow to higher ground. Southern parts of Wales, for example, could see some snow across the hills. And as I say, feeling rather cold and frosty across parts of the southeast. And then we see a fairly similar day, a mix of showers and some brighter spells. Once again, the showers mostly feeding in around eastern coasts, a few bubbling up inland by the time we reach the afternoon, and still a chance one or two could be heavy and still bringing some sleet and snow to higher ground, but fairly similar temperatures, highs of around 8 to 9 Celsius across the south. Then into the evening, we see a build of higher pressure that should kill off most of the showers. Still could see one or two in eastern areas, but once again under any clear skies, turning cold and likely to see some frost. Into next week, it is still going to be feeling chilly, but it should be largely dry with some bright or sunny spells at times. That's it from me. Bye-bye.
A nice bright morning will generate a lovely warm day, right through to the evening. Boxed Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
We want to spruce up your spring with an incredible £17,777 in tax-free cash that you can spend however you like. But that's not all, as you'll also receive not one, but two brand new designer watches and a fabulous Mulberry handbag. For a chance to win the cash, 2 watches and a designer bag, text cash to 63232. One entry costs £2 plus 1 standard network rate message, or text bonus to 63232. 5 entries cost £5 plus 1 standard network rate message. Go to gbnews.com/win. Entries start from just £2. Call 0903 681 3232. Calls cost £2 plus your network access charge, or post your name and number to GB12 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 6 p.m. on the 4th of April. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Britain's Newsroom. Weekday mornings from 9:30.
Aaron, this is a mad idea.
The future is bold. The future is hard, and it requires mad ideas, and we're proud to be bold and thought-provoking.
How are you going to make money out of this?
Well, the Olympics make $4.5 billion in revenue per Olympic cycle, and they're a wildly profitable organization that has never been challenged. So we're very proud to take them on and create something better and more efficient. It's not well known, but 44% of Olympians admit to using banned performance-enhancing substances, according to research funded by the International Olympic Committee and published in a top-tier scientific journal. It's absolutely rife. So 44% of elite athletes admit to using banned substances, only 1% get caught.
Would this not encourage the production of harder drugs, though? You know, steroids that go that bit further?
Absolutely. Right, and the goal is to create an environment where research and development are openly celebrated rather than being done in secret. When things are done in the open, we can study those compounds, and the drugs that allow athletes to run faster and jump higher are the same drugs that will allow all of us to be younger and faster and stronger for longer.
If, as you say, 44% of Olympians are actually using this stuff anyway, secretly behind the scenes in a sort of hidden and unregulated way, would it actually look that much different to you or I sitting in the stand watching people run 100 metres? Would they actually do it much faster?
Yeah, because you could have athletes who are in their 30s, maybe even in their 40s, breaking world records. And we're already seeing that with our athletes that we have in training. It's absolutely exceptional. If almost half of Olympians are already using banned substances, they're doing so in secret. They're not using the best available compounds. They're not doing it under clinical supervision. They're doing it to beat the drug testing, not to optimize their results.
The People's Channel.
Very, very good afternoon to you. It's 3 p.m. and welcome to the Martin Dalby Show here on GB News. We're broadcasting for you live from the heart of Westminster and all across the UK.
On today's show, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, is on a collision course with his union paymasters as he today took his so-called Project Chainsaw to the National Health Service. The sacred National Health Service, the Prime Minister, scrapped NHS England. Less bureaucracy, less red tape, more frontline care. Is Mr Starmer Nigel Farage in disguise? And yesterday, Donald Trump set Irish hearts sinking when he said, "We'd like our American companies back." Now, with the likes of Apple, Google and Microsoft paying an astonishing 24 billion euros in taxes to Ireland last year alone, could US tech giants leaving Ireland bankrupt the Emerald Isle? And later on